is to make this class, which is Intro to Africana Studies, a mandatory course for all students in order to graduate from the university. And so it's been part of myself with Dr. Keith Jones, who pushed the university to become an anti-racist public health promoting university. And so there's a little resistance, but I think with engagement, it'll change. And we have some definitions of what it means to deal with structural, to deal with the question of structural racism at these institutions.
Yes, that's right. So I believe we are already live on YouTube, guys. So I just wanted to touch base with Christine. If you can let me know if all of our panelists are here and if we're going to be good to go at any time soon.
I don't see all of the panelists, counselors. Carrie, are we ready to go?
Yep, I'm ready to go when you are, Madam Chair.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. In full disclosure, we have a long script here for you this morning. And so just bear with me because my eyesight is just not working today, but I'm gonna try my best. The committee, so let me just get to starting. I'm calling this hearing to an order, gaveling us in. For the record, my name is Julia Mejia, City Councilor at Large. I am the chair of the Boston City Council's Committee on Civil Rights and one of the sponsors of this docket. I'm joined by my co-sponsor, Councilor Bach of District 8. I believe we've also been joined by my colleagues, Councilor Liz Breeden from District 9 and Councilor Andrea Campbell from District 4. In accordance with Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021, modifying certain requirements of the open meeting law and relieving public bodies of certain requirements, including the requirement that public bodies conduct its meeting in a public place that is open and physically accessible to the public, the City Council will be conducting this hearing virtually via Zoom, and it's being recorded. This enables the City Council to carry out its responsibilities while adhering to public health accommodations and ensuring public access to its deliberations through adequate alternative means. The public may watch this meeting via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-TV and on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and Verizon Channel 964. It will also be rebroadcasted at a later date. If you wish to provide public testimony and have not signed up to do so, please email christine.o'donnell@boston.gov for the link. Also, written comments may be sent to the committee email at ccc.civilrights.gov and will be made part of the record and available to all to all the counselors. We have been joined by Councilor Flynn, District 2 as well. Today's hearing is on docket 0734, order for a hearing regarding reparations and their impact on civil rights of Black Bostonians. The structure of the hearing will be as follows. We will receive an African libation from Dr. Tony Van Deermeer and a land acknowledgement from Jean-Luc Pierre. Next, we will be hearing from our first panel composed of Dr. Jamari Kamara, who will speak to the history of reparations broadly, and Dr. Van Deermeer, who will speak specifically in regards to Boston's history. After their testimony, we will take questions from our colleagues. After the questions have been answered, we will move on to our second panel, consisting of Armani White, an advocate with Reclaim Boston, Aziza Robinson Goodnight, project director for the Boston Reparations Campaign, the New Democracy Coalition, Dr. Atia Martin, CEO and founder of All Aces, Inc., Tanisha Sullivan, president of the Boston NAACP, Tammy Tai, deputy director of King Boston, Kevin Peterson, executive director of New Democracy Coalition. Once we've heard from this panel, we will have colleagues ask their questions. Once they've answered, we will open up the floor for public testimony for a 30-minute for 30 minutes. After that 30 minutes, Yvette Modesty, National Reparations Advocate of the NAARC Commissioner, Encuentro Diaspora Afro will present. Counselors will be able to ask their questions to Yvette at this point. Once counselors have asked their questions, we will open it up to the administration for their testimony, which includes Chief Lori Nelson, Resilience Officer for the Mayor's Office of Resiliency and Racial Equity, Jessica Phillip, Director of Initiatives and Partnerships for the Mayor's Office of Resiliency and Racial Equity, and Selena Barrios Milner, Chief Equity and Inclusion Cabinet. Once the administration is done presenting, council will ask their questions to the administration. Finally, once counselors are done with their questions, we will open up the floor for remaining members of the public to offer their testimony. We will do our best to strictly follow the structure of the hearings as I have laid out, because it was carefully crafted by our advocates. Because this is going to be such a long hearing, I'm going to forego having opening remarks and instead open up the floor to the opening that our advocates have offered. If counselors wish to offer some introductory remarks, I ask that they do it during their question time. And I also would just like to give a quick shout out to Tanisha Sullivan, Tammy Tai, Yvette Modestine, Aziza Goodnight Robinson for all of your hard work in putting this together and getting us here. It was a collaborative effort. We have always said that we're here to step to the side and let others lead. And this is what it looks like when we work in deep community. And I'm so incredibly grateful for your partnership and leadership in this whole entire process. So without further ado, Dr. Van der Meer, you have the floor.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And good morning to the Boston City Council members and to the community members attending at large. At this moment of assemblage, we pay homage to our African ancestors, those from whom humanity originated and of who all share a common ancestry with. We pay homage to those African ancestors who experienced the Naacp, the horrific, torturous, dehumanized voyage of the Middle Passage, the exploitation of their labor, and they were used as human capital to build the industrial Western world. We pay homage to those African ancestors whose status as enslaved non-persons worked the agricultural landscape from sunup to sundown, those who were known and unknown, whose lives, legacies, and inheritance were brutally stolen from them. We pay homage to our African ancestors whose nightmare voyage brought them to the seaports of Boston, where laws, governmental structures, and commercial interests were complicit in an international enterprise of dehumanizing, enslaving, and commodifying African people to benefit commercial capital development. We pay homage to our African ancestors, offsprings who worked for and endured these systems of oppression, structural racism, and white supremacy that maintain segregated schools, neighborhoods, poor jobs and low wages, inadequate healthcare, redlining by banks, police brutality and murder, mass incarceration, drug-infested communities, and gentrification. We summon the spirits of all our ancestors to be present right now in this space and to guide us as we seek justice for the harm and for the restoration of our humanity and inalienable human rights to self-determination. We pour libations to honor our ancestors whose shoulders we all stand on. We pour libations for those ancestors who resisted by any means necessary to their subjugation. We pour libations to refresh their freedom dreams and the sacrifices they made for us to live our lives in peace and power and to make the world a better, equitable, and inclusive place. For those Africans in antiquity, for those Africans who were colonized, for those Africans who were enslaved, who endured the Middle Passage, Naacp, for those Africans who slaved in the fields of America, for those Africans who were enslaved as servants, for those offsprings of Africans whose children sat in, laid in, marched, protested, boycotted, and rebelled to let the world know that Black Lives Matter. We pour libations for those African ancestors. And I will pour water as a symbolic gesture and say Ashe, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Am I on mute? Okay, thank you so very much, Dr. Van Diermeer. Next, we will have Jean-Luc for the land acknowledgement. Jean-Luc, you now have the floor.
Dr. Van Diermeer, thank you to Councilor Mejia. Thank you to Councilor Bach for this hearing. As is our practice at the North American Indian Center of Boston, it is our duty to recognize the land that we're on, the land that holds us and the land that sustains us. I want for a second for you to imagine a world beyond 400 years ago in which there were people on this land. Perhaps where we know there to be water, there was once land, and where there is now land, perhaps there was once water. And I want you to think and hold those people that have lived, that have loved, that have raised their families, and that are buried here. And now I want you to go back beyond the time that we are in now, into a time perhaps 400 years into the future, thinking about all of the buildings that we're in right now. Perhaps they're not there anymore. But in one instance that we want to hold is that the people remain. The people that lived here, that loved here, that died here, they still continue to this day. And I want to bring you back to the present. And I want you to think about the land that you're on right now as the traditional indigenous territory of the Massachusetts Nation, who continue to this day in part through their lineal descendants, the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog. I want you to hold the Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, the Abenaki, the Micmac, the Maliseet, the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, all those who have held these lands as sacred. And also, when we recognize the land, we are making certain agreements with our hosts. One such agreement that we make at Naacp, and I hope that you will join us, is in the support of every effort by our host tribes for the rematriation of land and natural resources back to the original peoples. And of course, just pray for a good hearing today in recognizing the racist and colonial violence of this area. Let that be a promise as well. Thank you, Tikach.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. Really do appreciate that land acknowledgement and setting the tone, and to our colleagues who worked with us on organizing this, to making sure that we ground ourselves in this work. So thank you for that. I would like Councilor Bach, who is our co-sponsor, to open up the floor before we begin to make her introductory remarks. Councilor Bach, thank you so much for your partnership. You now have the floor.
Thank you so much, Councilor Mejia. I'll be brief because I think we just have many people with a lot of wisdom and insight to share. I'll just say that I was proud to co-sponsor this with Councilor Mejia, recognizing that our history and really, the history of harm and despoilment that goes back to the Native peoples and also to the folks of African descent who were brought to this country it's a deep and lasting scar. It still continues to affect our country in every kind of policy arena. And I think it's a good space to be talking about it. It's a better space to be thinking about what we can do that really feels reparative together. So definitely something that I, with my historian hat on, have been very aware of and have been involved in some efforts to do history in institutions that I've been a part of. I think that when we talk about government, it opens up the conversation in a way that can be harder because there's more people involved than in a particular institution, but it also, carries a lot of promise to kind of come together and do something meaningful and different. So again, like Councillor Mejia said, not here as an expert, just here as a co-sponsor, and looking forward to the conversation today, and really grateful to everybody who's come into this room with us. So thank you, Councillor Mejia.
Thank you, Councillor Bach. We will now move on to our first panel, and I ask that our panelists please keep their remarks to around 5 minutes. So Dr. Kamara, we will start with you before going to Dr. Van der Meer. So you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Councilors Mejia and Bach. I greatly appreciate you for holding this hearing and allowing us to step forward and acknowledge a very long tradition of speaking to this question of reparations. I've been asked to speak to several hundred years of history in approximately 5 minutes, and I will do my best to respect others who are coming behind me. But I need to, in the beginning, clarify of what we speak. This question of reparations, what is this that we are talking about? What is the reparations for which we are petitioning the city to establish a study commission for the development of proposals for reparations for repair? At its core, we're speaking about repair. That is the intersection between truth and reconciliation. We're speaking about a process, not an act, of healing, of personal, institutional, and systemic healing and restoration. We're speaking of accountability. Accountability in facing the harms which have been done, and a process of repair. Repair of the social rupture, of the contract between those of us who are human, not only a social contract. We're speaking not only of the repair with regard to a transactional action, but we're speaking of a process of transformative actions. We're seeking social justice. But in order to acquire a position of justice, we must go through a process of accountability and collective repair. Where we are is actually quite clear. Particularly in Boston, we have been brought to a place where before us, the Federal Reserve, more than 5 years ago, placed in our face a document, The Color of Wealth, that laid before us, laid bare the economic, social inequality within our community. We know the data, 247, right, 1,500 median income wealth for whites, $8. Some have argued about the methodology. Okay, let's argue. 800, 8,000, it doesn't matter. The injustice and clearly the transgenerational wealth transfer that has occurred to some has not impacted other communities. We have a responsibility to address this at all of its levels of social, economic, psychological impact. The question is not what needs to be done. The fundamental issue is whether we have the political will to establish a commission that will allow us to engage in depth a process and a comprehensive program. Many of my colleagues are going to speak about individual issues that need to be addressed, whether it's PTSD, that is the post-traumatic slavery disorder, or the impacts on our income, wealth, social disparities. We will speak about that today. But at its core is, do we have the political will to establish a commission, as others have already done before us, and we will speak about that. Other cities such as Evanston, other states such as California. speaking about this here in Massachusetts is very important in that this issue was first acknowledged to have been raised right here by Belinda, a former slave. In 1782, Belinda petitioned the state legislature, having been a former slave, to seek a pension for herself and her disabled child. She was only partially successful, but out of the process of Belinda and others who were in that period, another former slave entitled Walker, in 1783, the state of Massachusetts, which had been the first in 1641 to sanction slavery of the British colonies, would finally abolish slavery. But there is a word that we will hear used continually today, that with the abolition of slavery, we did not deny our complicity. And from that period, we have continued to be complicit in our state with the denial of the basic human rights of people of African descent in multiple ways. And it is to this that we need to address ourselves through such a commission to study these questions. The privatization of profit and its accumulation has been brought to the forefront in the legal case brought forward by Farmer Pullman versus Fleet Boston. You may well have heard about this case, which was brought to the court. Fleet Boston having assumed the assets of another bank entitled the Providence Bank. Providence Bank, which had accrued its major resources from the shipping of African commodities. That human cargo was the revenue which had been then used by the family in ownership of that and has seeded the endowment for Brown University. You can go to their website and the entire story is there before you. But like many of the other institutions in our area, such as Harvard and Yale, their endowments and the billion-dollar empires that they sit upon, tax-free, have been generated from the backs of a slave labor system. And we have been complicit in this process. So too, other institutions in our community, such as the Catholic Church, and even the Unitarian Universalists, have been complicit in sanctioning that system and accruing wealth and profits that have gone to their institutions. Ultimately, as you will recall, the slave trade was abolished by the British in 1807. That occurred due to the only successful rebellion of Africans in the Western Hemisphere. And with the success of the Haitian Revolution in 1804, the colonists throughout the Western Hemisphere, led by the British, sought to curtail the trade. In 1807, the United States would follow in 1808, curtailing the trade, but not slavery itself. It was not until 1836 that the British actually emancipate the slaves. But in that process of the emancipation of slaves, would pay 20 million pounds, 1/5 of the GDP of the British Empire, to the slave owners, and not a dime to those who had been enslaved. I know I must acknowledge my time, and I am very considerate of those who will follow me. But this lineage that we are discussing that goes through a very critical period of Reconstruction in this country after our own emancipation in 1863. The petitioning brought forth by Belinda was only codified in a legal document before the state legislature with the advocacy of the first Black state senator in the history of Massachusetts, which would come some 200 years later, with the election of Senator Bill Owens, who was the first contemporary legislator to put forward a bill calling for a reparations commission in 1988 in the General Court of the state of Massachusetts. There would not be hearings on that bill. But it is that piece of legislation that in fact created the foundation for a piece of legislation filed in the Congress, which is now entitled H.R. 40, modeled on the legislation filed in the state of Massachusetts, which has never been heard. We have an opportunity here to bring forward the process, first enshrined in legislation, never heard, but to, in fact, in Boston, establish such a commission that can help us begin to bridge this gap of acknowledgement leading to reconciliation, but passing through the process of accountability through the form of a reparations commission. And I urge the council to listen carefully to the testimony today and to move to establish such a commission, which would allow us to do the work that needs to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kamara. Yes, I will acknowledge that you did, this is, I think, one of the hardest things, especially chairing a hearing as thoughtful as this and being super mindful of time, but it's just not in my nature to stick to the rules when there's so much humanity that needs to be centered in the way we do business. So thank you for educating us, and to my colleagues and those who are tuning in. Yeah, we're going to be breaking the rules slightly here today because there's just so much at stake for the work, but I am going to try to keep us moving and ask everyone for their patience as we continue to move through this process. So thank you for that. And I also wanted to just quickly acknowledge that we have also been joined by my colleague, Councillor Flaherty at large, who has joined us as well. So Dr. Vandermeer and Councillor Wu has also joined us. Thank you, Councillor at large, Wu is also here with us this morning. So Dr. Vandermeer, you now have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Kamara. I want to go back to some of the points that Dr. Kamara had made. When you look at particularly the period of the 1800s, when the question of reparations were brought up, or where will the people who were enslaved, where they would go? The question was, how were they going to reimburse the slave owners and not the people who were enslaved? But of course, as you know, the states got into a big fight around the compromise, Missouri Compromise, and whether we want to have a slave state or a free state. And that part of that is that in Boston, that they had outlawed, in Massachusetts, outlawed slavery. But you had the fugitive slave law, which made it mandatory for folks to submit to that. And so when folks who escaped and came to Boston, they had magistrates looking for them to return them back to their proper owner, right? But even in terms of during that time, that we have to understand what the laws were that began to continue to treat Black people as non-persons, right? So that when we go to the Supreme Court decision of the Dred Scott in 1857, it said Black people, fundamentally, the Black people had no rights that white people were bound to respect. That, began to be the basis in terms of moving the radical Republicans around the Civil War, and after the Emancipation Proclamation, and then the Civil War began, going to the first Civil Rights Act of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, of which, freed those who were enslaved, abolished slavery. But then the 14th Amendment was the Equal Rights Amendment, which sort of made us citizens. But from that point on, that you begin to deal with Reconstruction, and which we can say was sort of a joke, because we're still trying to deal with the question of Reconstruction. But the resegregation, or I won't say the resegregation, but the further segregation of Black people, which was again codified in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And then it was supposedly going through that period of segregation, even for Black men and women who fought in the Army, had to be in segregated troops, segregated barracks, had to ride on segregated buses and trains and so forth. And then going up to the Brown versus Board of Education that said separate but equal was not equal. And we've been fighting from that point, but those laws and policies still have their footprints and is present today. Look at the school, the segregation that we were trying to deal with in the 70s. Look at the housing that we had to begin to. Look at the redlining. Let's deal with what's happening with that, even in the form of gentrification. Let's look at the police brutality and murders that happened in this community. I don't know if people remember, with the Charles Stewart case, where the police went to communities like they were stormtroopers somewhere, raiding communities when they found out that it wasn't a Black person who did that. Let's talk about Leave Our Heart, a 14-year-old kid, 90 pounds, shot in the back of his head. So there are many incidents in terms of where we see policies that reflect this city in terms of how Black people were treated and how we're still marginalized. Not to mention the $8 net worth. They're saying that for a single Black woman, the net worth is $5 compared to $41,000 for white females and so forth. So there's a lot of work that we have to do, but we have to acknowledge these disparities, this inequality, this injustice in order to deal with the harm that was done and to go towards restoration and healing so that we can begin to live decently as human beings and live in peace. Otherwise, James Baldwin made it very clear, it will be fire the next time. So I'm going to end with that.
Wow, you ended on time. Okay. Thank you for that. I really do appreciate, and I appreciate
my students like your enthusiasm.
Yes. So I really do appreciate your timeliness, and more importantly, the gems of wisdom that you dropped on us. I think it's important to understand the specific history of slavery and reparations as it relates to Boston, and you gave some really clear examples of how that shows up. I'll now open the floor up to my colleagues to ask their questions. I ask our counselors to keep their Q&A portion to no more than 5 minutes for their first round. And unlike our guest, I will definitely be holding you accountable to that 5-minute situation here, y'all. So use your time wisely. I'm going to, in order of arrival and leading with my co-sponsor, Counselor Bach from District 8, you now have the floor.
Thanks so much, Counselor Mejia. I wanted to ask Mr. Kamara, you mentioned the commission, and sort of I'd love to use this time to just hear from you what you think is critical in the formation of such a commission, whether there are good examples elsewhere that you've seen or not, and sort of like what you really want to get in our minds about how to think about starting something like that. Because I strongly agree with the instinct that that for that kind of work, you need a group beyond the city council. So I very much want to echo that, but I'd love to hear more details from you on kind of what you envision.
Thank you very much, Counselor. There have been a number of examples of such commissions established around the country and even globally. And we need to, I think, be careful of that, because in dealing with this issue, there has been a truth and reconciliation process called for in many, actually, countries, from Argentina to South Africa. And one of the findings of that process has been that you cannot reach reconciliation without repair. That is the intersection between truth and reconciliation. And therefore, looking at specifically a reparations commission to help us move to reconciliation is important. State of California, most recently, of other areas, Evanston, Illinois is a city, Chicago, a number of cases that you could look at. But the state of California, initiated by Shirley Weber, who was an assemblywoman, who happened to have also been the president of the National Council of Black Studies and is now the Secretary of State of California, established a reparations commission in which they have a charge to bring back to the state through a set of commissioners who were appointed both by the legislature and the governor to a report that will do a number of things in looking at concrete specific proposals that will engage the state in a process, not a single act, but a process of repair, looking at both economic justice, social concerns, psychological, mental health, the broad range of comprehensive supports to deal with this question of repair and healing. This is the kind of approach that I think would be most effective, that allows you to then use the resources of public institutions, of the academy, of the fiscal interest, and the spiritual community as well. Because central to these issues is a kind of spiritual healing and renewal that we need in this country and certainly in our community. So they have a commission that will have balance in terms of those who are contributing to the ideas and the concrete proposals. Understanding the necessity to politically balance the interests of who has representation on the commission, but having it grounded in community representatives who also have knowledge, skills to bring to the process.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Kamara. That's a really helpful model to know about. And I guess just one question for Dr. Vandermeer. I was wondering, one of the things that I have heard from folks who have explored this in other areas is to really try to bring that specificity to local history, right? And to recognize that that while there's a whole national story that Boston is a part of and that we also have to tell and connect to, that sometimes, especially in the Northeast, we kind of get into this mind frame of, oh, that stuff happened elsewhere in the country, and really connecting it here is important. So I just wondered if, I know we're going to hear about different sort of areas from the next panel, but whether there's any particular real Boston focused story that you think that this process should be keying off of or keeping in mind or raising up for folks?
Well, I think if you look at the economic disparities, the question of low wages, that white workers receive versus Black workers, the question of redlining, right? Even the question of the kind of education that Black people and poor people were subjected to. And so if you aren't able to get the resources to develop, to buy, to pay your rent, to put a down payment on a housing or start a small business, it's going to put you at a disadvantage. So when you talk about equity, let's talk about it. Nevertheless, the fact that that Black people are treated different than other people when it comes to the judicial system, to the police and so forth. So I think that we have to look at how do we begin to create fairness and equity in terms of the banks, and making sure that the city could use all its power to try to address that question in terms of who they do business with, who gets contracts. I mean, I find it quite interesting that over I don't know how many years, but the idea that you can see the gentrification go the way that it's going. So somehow city government was allowing people to build in places in which proliferated the housing market in ways that outprice people that they can't hear. I got professors over at this university who can't find a house to buy, and some people who can't even, afford to pay the rents, in particular, a lot of my students. So I think that the question of around the economy and housing are places to look at how Black people have been disadvantaged in this particular city. I want to also add that it's interesting that Boston was a seaport in which they brought many people who were enslaved here, and few of them, worked, with small groups of people, whether they were servants or whatever it is. So there was more plantation slavery as it was in the South, right? But Boston made plenty of money, right? Finances make money, dealing in the business of slavery, and particularly as it came into manufacturing and other aspects in terms of dealing with textiles and so forth. So it's a lot of money that's going through Boston was based on the enslavement of African people, and we got to address that.
Great. Thank you so much, Councilor Mejia.
Yes, thank you, Councilor Bach. And I just want to note to my colleagues, don't think I'm playing favorites, but I did allow Councilor Bach to go a little over. She is my co-sponsor, but I'm not expecting you all to model that behavior. And I want you all to keep your questions to 5 minutes. And so I'd love to go next to Councilor Breeden from District 9. You now have the floor for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to yourself and Councillor Bach for bringing this issue forward. I'm really here to listen and learn this morning. I do have some time constraints. I need to jump off at 11. So I have no questions. I'm just going to keep listening, and thank you so much. And I look forward to this initiative moving forward with all their guidance. And thank you to all the panelists this morning for your contribution and sharing with us this morning. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Breeden, for joining us and leading into this conversation. Really do appreciate your presence here. And just because we have saved some time doesn't necessarily mean that Councilor Campbell can go on more than 5 minutes. So Councilor Campbell, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. And of course, thank you to you and Councilor Bach for the hearing order, for the conversation. Thank you to all the advocates and the panelists for joining the conversation and being, frankly, at the forefront on these issues in your respective spaces. I also want to give a special shout out to Atia and Yvette, who for years were having and engaging counselors on these very issues and played a critical role in us filing a hearing order earlier in the year on establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as mentioned by Dr. Vandermeer and of course, Mr. Kamara. And so I do encourage us or you, I will continue the work post this council for sure, on looking at that hearing order, because it was informed by civil rights legends who are local, Margaret Burnham and many others who have done this work locally and internationally, and who have experience in creating such commissions, modeled, in many ways, or I should say, many of the newer commissions you're seeing in California and other places modeled on ideas that are coming right out of Boston. And so I do think it's timely that we have this conversation in the city to set up such a commission. I would encourage us to even be broader in scope. Reparations can come in many forms, of course, but when developing the hearing order on the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, really focused on the truth part, because there are so many folks in the city of Boston, as evidenced by the historical conversation we've started with, they don't have a clue what we're referencing and talking about, which is really sad, including residents of color. So the truth piece is critical. You can't get to the latter part, has been stated, without that first part. But then the other piece that was really our team explored and really were just taken aback by was the possibilities of all the restorative and restorative solutions that the city could adopt, reparations being one of them, but also historic markers adjusting our curriculum within even our own schools. So many other things that could serve as solutions to what has been the oppression and marginalization of Black people since the founding of this country. And so there are a lot of incredible ideas out there. I absolutely look forward to being a part of these conversations post the council when I wrap up my term, and really grateful to the advocates and the folks in the community and all of the panelists for the work you've done. I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm going to give any time I have left to all of you to share, and I'll stay in touch with you, Councilor Mejia and Councilor Bach, but I can't express my gratitude enough for everyone who was on here to push the city and the Commonwealth to do what's necessary in this moment of time. So thank you. And thank you so much, Mr. Kamara and Dr. Vandermeer, for those incredible words in only 5 minutes, which was remarkable. Really appreciate your leadership and your hard work on behalf of all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Campbell. Looking forward to our continued work together. And I echo the sentiments in regards to those who have already been pounding the pavement and doing this work. And I do believe that Boston right now in its history has an opportunity to meet this moment with courage and political will. So looking forward to what that's going to look like and working in partnership with the trailblazers that set the foundation for it. So I'd love to open up the floor now to, I've been notified that Councilor Flynn and Flaherty are no longer here. So I'm going to move on next to Councilor Michelle Wu, who's at large. Councilor Wu, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to everyone for not just this conversation today, but as mentioned, many years and much ground tread already on ensuring that Boston is confronting our legacy of racism, systemic racism, and looking to provide the structures that could provide a way for healing, conversations, and then taking action. So I just wanted to add my gratitude to the two sponsors, to Councilor Campbell as well for all of her work on the council and raising this topic and providing solutions already, and to the many speakers who will be participating today. I'm really grateful and look forward to staying part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Wu. Just curious, do you have any specific questions for our previous presenters, or are we good?
I'm good. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Myself on mute. So thank you so very much to my colleagues for joining and being a part of the conversation. I will now turn it over to our second panel. Once again, I ask that panelists please keep their testimony to no more than 5 minutes. We will start with Armani White. Armani, you now have the floor.
Hey folks, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, awesome. So yeah, happy to be here today to talk about reparations in Boston, well, specifically reparations and the effect of white supremacy on Black Bostonians. My name is Armani White, and I'm here today as first and foremost, as a descendant of enslaved Africans, someone who's a third-generation Bostonian who fights really hard for the liberation of Black people. And I just want to, and so I work currently at the Center for Economic Democracy as the director of campaigns, where we fight for a future world and economy that doesn't require the exploitation of humans and their spirits. And I also am the co-founder of Reclaim Roxbury, which is an organization founded in 2014 to actually organize Black residents in Roxbury to determine their own future of how public land is used in Roxbury, which is a historically Black community. And so when I got invited to talk about reparations and housing in Boston, I was very excited because this is something that I've done a good amount of thinking about in my studies about the history of how we've ended up with a city the way that we have it. And I won't go on too long because I know I have a limit here, but I'm going to go into some history of what Black people have dealt with when it comes to land and land being taken away from them in Boston, and how we have landed today, that I think will set some good context for counselors as we think through this commission and next steps. But when it comes to land in Boston, it comes down to, land, freedom, wealth, and power. And having land has allowed folks to have freedom, wealth, and power, which is essential for Black people and their freedom in this country. The first Black person to own land in Boston, from what I've seen and research, is a gentleman by the name of Boston Ken in 1656, which is pre-Revolutionary War. And this is a Black man who was able to, through his hardworking, acquire land. Another Black person, a Black woman, first one in the country to own land, is Zipporah Potter Atkins in 1656. So Black people, despite being brought here in chains as slaves, were able to get free and get land, and that was a way that they were able to find find freedom, wealth, and power. With that land, Boston Ken, the first Black person to own land, was able to leverage that to free another Black man by mortgaging his property. So we see that having land, having access to it, has been a part of Black people's freedom here in Boston. And the way in which Black people's land has been taken away from them, and the way that they've been not allowed to access and own land, has been a part of this history. And I'm just realizing how blurry my camera is, so I'm gonna try to give it a little light. Here we go. And so, important for folks to understand that Black people in Boston, right? We came here in slaves, as you've heard people talk about. We came here in chains as slaves, and then we got free. We fought to get our own people free, and then we were faced at every step with opposition from white people who wanted to see us used as capital and not as people, with the hopes and desires for freedom, wealth, and power. And so, if you follow the history of it, we got, there was Black people who fought to help beat the British. There's Black people who went and fought to make sure that we maintained our unity during the Civil War. We know that slavery was abolished here in Massachusetts in 1781, but that it wouldn't be abolished in the rest of the country until 1886. In that 100-year period, Black people were in Boston fighting for the liberation of other Black people across the country. During that period, though, they still faced discrimination and lack of access to land. The one area in Boston where Black people were able to actually gain a footing, as we know, or maybe you don't know, Beacon Hill, which is now a majority white affluent community, was formerly majority African American, and down into the West End area was a majority Black community and a Black political base in Boston. And so we think about the history of land, power, wealth, and freedom. The West End was where Black people were able to hold political office for years prior to, in the midst of a country where Black people were not allowed to vote in the South. And so as time went on, we have attempts by the powers to basically disenfranchise Black people and their power base. Starting in the West End of Boston, there was efforts to weaken the structure of how the city government was run back in the day, where there was essentially 8 aldermen and 25 wards with 3 representatives from each of them. That was shrunken to make power, to essentially centralize power in the city of Boston, and to take away what little power Black people, immigrants, had gotten in the years following the Civil War. And so I'm gonna speed up to current day because I'm getting into the history is important, but it just sets the tone for today. So again, Black people, Boston, restricted to own land, operate out of the West End of Boston, a political power base in the country. In 1900s, we saw America growing, the Roaring 20s. Come the 50s, there's money from the federal government to help land federal monies to redevelop cities, to make them more, to essentially to revitalize them. Part of that plan led to the West End, parts of the immigrant community in Boston, JP Roxbury, being chosen as areas to be basically raised for the development of the business sector. So the history of Black people, as we've heard Professor Vandermeer talk about, is about using us in our community and our bodies for capital. And so our community, and so the history of land in Boston is similar So this West End was selected to be developed to be basically a city and a highway. Nowadays, the West End doesn't exist. So that opportunity to actually hold on to land was taken when the BRA was founded after urban renewal by the city council. So important to understand all this information, to understand how we have a city now where Black people net worth is $8 compared to white people's $250,000. You know, what would it look like if Black people had been able to own that, had to hold on to the land in the West End from that time to now? That land is how we know that people build wealth. Fast forwarding, we know that the West End raising was something that the city has acknowledged was a wrong decision and has talked about and has said sorry. But what does it look like to actually heal the harms and actually do something about that? Fast forwarding a bit more, we know that in the city of Boston, the fights with the BRA have been some of the most famous fights that we've seen Black and brown communities take on. So important to recognize, came here as slaves, got free, were able to purchase land. That land was taken from us by a city government and used to create way for business. That is, like, if that doesn't speak to the need for reparations today. Important to note that, again, we were promised 40 acres and a mule post-emancipation. That never happened. So in Boston, the opposite happened. The land that we did have was taken from us. And so you have, for example, my uncle, Walter Clark, his family, or it's like a Black uncle, right? My dad's best friend, but his family is an Anvil, and they were artisans, and they owned land in Roxbury and owned a blacksmith that was taken from them for urban renewal to make way for a highway that we know famously folks like former Councilor Chuck Turner fought against, and that folks like Carolyn Crockett have written about. That is those businesses that could have been multi-million-dollar businesses today that were not allowed to grow because the city decided to take that land from Black people. So when we talk about reparations, slavery, it's so far away, it doesn't touch us. There's like a direct through line in the city of Boston, the BPDA, the BRA, playing a role in the disenfranchisement and the removal of land for Black people. So important so I'm going to wrap up here because I know I got limited time, but I just want to drive my point home here. In the following the after the urban renewal, 1950s, 60s, 70s, America as a country is trying to get its books in order, its ducks in a row. You have in the city of Boston people like Mel King, Chuck Turner fighting with the BRA about highways, about the removal of Black people from the Madison Park area. People fighting to even proposing in their frustration to secede from Boston. Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, Black communities advocated at one point to actually leave the city of Boston. And in each step in trying to basically build their access to land, power, freedom, and wealth, Black people in Boston have been faced with opposition from the BRA. Important to know, right? The BRA changed its name in 2016 to the BPDA. So you'll hear me go between BPDA and BRA, but that's because, but that's only because the name changed. The function and form hasn't. And as an organizer in 2016, who helped found Reclaim Roxbury, which continues the fight of this long history of battling city government over land, we see that, that the calls to abolish it, the calls to reform the BPDA that we hear happening are not misplaced and come from a long history of folks feeling like the BPDA, the BRA serves a function to just harm the Black community. I grew up hearing the acronym, the BRA stood for the Black Removal Agency. And that's just a fact of what Black people in Boston know. So I'm gonna wrap up by saying, what do we do about it? I just kind of described a long history of how Black people have been, stripped of land, power, wealth, freedom here in Boston through intentional government actions. So what intentional government actions can be taken to heal that harm? We have millions of dollars in American Rescue Plan money coming. How could that be targeted to Black communities for home ownership and to take land off of the speculative market? We have some of the first first Black-led land trust, or the first land trust in America, and it was a Black-led project, the Dorchester Street Neighborhood Initiative, DSNI. What would it look like to try to heal the harms? It's going to take a lot, but it's clear that there's a case for it here in Boston when you look through this long history and look at the work of folks like Mel King, Chuck Turner, Byron Rushing, who focused on this like history of land, and folks to this day who are still fighting, like Reclaim Roxbury, focusing on how the city leads development and decides on how public land is being used. Currently, the last biggest parcel of land in the Black community, Parcel P3, is being put out to essentially, as being developers are being encouraged to reply to an RFP there, and it's going to be really important as we look at how to heal the harms of slavery and reparations to see how that development is done and how land in Boston generally is used to uplift Black people or continue a long history of removing their wealth, their power, and their freedom. So happy to talk today, and yeah, would love to talk to y'all more if you ever want to hear more.
Yeah, thank you, Armani. And I also just wanted to thank again our lead organizers, Yvette, Tammy, Tanisha, and Aziza, for really lining up this amazing and powerful panel for today to help us get everything on the record. I want to also acknowledge that one of our panelists, Kevin Peterson from the New Democracy Coalition, has a time constraint. So with the permission of my lead organizers, we're going to allow him to have his 5 minutes for his presentation. And I'm not sure if he's going to be able to come back for the question and answer portion, but at the very least, would like to make sure that Kevin Peterson, you have an opportunity, since you've been such a steadfast leader in this space, would love to make sure that you get on the record in terms of this conversation. So Kevin, you now have the floor.
Thank you. You can hear me, correct? You
Yes.
can hear me? Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair, women and members of the Boston City Council and attendees. My name is the Reverend Dr. Kevin Peterson. I reside in Dorchester. I'm a founder of the New Democracy Coalition, which focuses in the area of civic literacy, civic policy, and electoral justice. Among other things, I'm the creator of the Just Vote campaign, now underway in Boston. The NDC created this program purposely 6 years ago with the intentionality of fostering a new civil society within Boston's Black community by way of reorienting a sense of citizenship, social purpose, and cultural reframing. The Just Vote campaign is an authentic expression of a Black-led organization and institution in Boston. I mentioned Just Vote, that campaign, because it may indeed stand as a metaphor, an allegory, if you will, of the type of vision needed for the creation of a true and sustained reparations movement in Boston. In 2021, the New Democracy Coalition held a press conference calling for reparations in Boston. In light of my calling as a minister of the gospel, I'd like to say that the NDC issued a prophetic call for reparations in Boston at that time. Our call was aimed specifically at members of the Boston City Council and former Mayor Marty Walsh. The call for reparations was specifically made within the larger context of a call for the change of the name of Faneuil Hall. This call for reparations in Boston was made to elected officials in the aftermath of the George Floyd lynching. But before that, the call was also made in the context of the racial violence in Charlottesville, Virginia. The call from the NDC activists was not the first call for reparations among Boston's Black leadership, but it was among the most recent. And so when the call was made in Boston, the world paid attention. The Associated Press reporting from Boston about the call was heard in China and in Russia and Europe and parts of Africa. Please allow me to offer these observations. Our call for reparations in Boston is intricately linked to the Faneuil Hall story and its tragic legacy that is grounded in a Boston narrative of white supremacy. We know this to be true, that Faneuil Hall represents a hall of horror for Black people who know its history. Peter Faneuil, for whom the hall was named, was a racist and a Boston citizen who considered Black Bostonians as nothing more than talking work animals. Peter Faneuil reduced the enslaved of Boston, the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, to the status of things from which creativity could be stolen, things from which sexual pleasure could be forcefully derived, things from which the exploitation in terms of money could be manifested. as I conclude, we are unequivocally clear in our call in the light of the 2021 Boston economy that reparations is due, and that a reparations commission to study the legacy of the misery impacted by Blacks is important. I end on two important notes of caution and concern, Madam Chairwoman. First, before this commission is created, the city must apologize for the crime of slavery that it helped create and perpetuate. There would be no Boston as it currently is situated without the crimes and indignity the city fostered upon a race of Africans who would soon become African Americans and Bostonians. The city council, this city council, and the current mayor, who is a daughter of slaves, should be cognizant of this past that connects the current political realities from the past to the current reality. Here is a valuable analogy. Slavery was wrong. Boston participated in slavery. Boston must now apologize for slavery. The current elected leadership of the city is duty-bound to make this apology before a genuine movement around reparations in Boston is perpetuated. My second caution is that if we are to move forward with a level of mutual respect and care, we must commit to the fact that the commission must be Black-led and Black-controlled with the participation of others who may not be Black. I say this because Blacks in Boston possess their own agency, their own intelligence, their own cultural and historical lenses, and that will, in all likelihood, facilitate a special perspective on this process and a special perspective in terms of the extent to which Black lives matter. I conclude simply with this. A, understand Faneuil Hall as a specific cause and condition of current misery and suffering by Black people in the city. It is an example, a synecdoche of racial hate that persists in the city, and the changing of its name represents a form of reparations. B, apologize for slavery before the creation of the commission. If the mayor of the city of Boston and members of the council continue to ignore the fact that they govern on the historical notions of hate towards Black people, then that's very disappointing. And finally, let Black people lead on the issue. Thank you very much for your time. I am apologetic that I will not be able to stay for any questions, but I very much appreciate this issue coming before the council, and I look forward to participating in the future.
Thank you, Kevin. Really do appreciate your remarks. So I'm going to move on now to Asisa Robinson. Good night. Asisa, you now have the floor, and thank you again for all your leadership in this space.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia, and thank you, ladies who I've worked with over the last, I think it's a month and a half. It's been a short journey, but it's been great, and I'm happy to be working with you. So I'm here. My name is Aziza Robinson Goodnight. I'm a Bostonian whose family has been here for multiple generations and whose land has been taken by urban renewal. I'm a voter. I'm a voter. I'm the project director for the New Democracy Coalition's Boston Reparations Campaign, the chair for the Frederick Douglass Sculpture Project, and a daughter of the Black arts community. In full disclosure, I am very invested in urging for racial equity in Boston. Sorry. I'm very invested in urging for racial equity in Boston, and will directly be addressing arts, culture, and healing. This statement is an expression of my demand for reparations in Boston. I'm aware of the struggles within the Black community, especially as they pertain to social justice. Blacks have lived in Boston before its founding as a city, and thousands of others who have built this country and arrived as enslaved people. Boston must apologize for a racist past and creating an image of Black existence as a danger, for pushing the agenda of racial bias in plain sight. The historical past of systematic policies that have created the idea of a dangerous Black existence, resulting in redlining, employment discrimination, healthcare and education disparities, and even racist discriminatory dress codes at dining and entertainment venues that directly target urban fashion. The Black community has experienced enough trauma and expected to heal while white America stands on our backs. The nonprofit industrial complex and charter school experiment has ravished our neighborhoods with sob stories of how poor and blight our people are, and the wealth gap has loomed over our heads like a catchphrase with no resolve. As my mentor, Bethia Carter, always drills into my head, those who control the image control the mind. Before, during, and after times of hardship, many in the Black communities create art to take in the pain and struggle and release a beauty that heals and teaches. Black creatives are always working, trying to find some understanding and envisioning a better world. Preservation of our history, creative healing spaces, and positive images of Black existence is as important to the conversation about reparations as all other sectors. To quote the American Art Therapy Association's article about healing racial wounds, in healing, we recognize our common humanity, acknowledge the truth of past wrongs, and build authentic relationships capable of transforming communities and shifting our national discourse. Over the past decade, health psychologists have cautiously begun looking at how the arts might be used in a variety of ways to heal emotional injuries, increase understanding of oneself and others, develop a capacity for self-reflection, reduce symptoms and alter behaviors and thinking patterns. Given the ubiquity of creative expression, as well as the relative ease of engagement, the extent in which psychological and physiological effects are sustainably healthy, health enhancing. Can we imagine a world where we exist like this? Not only does the art have the ability to heal emotional, spiritual, and physical wounds, it also can be a driving force to help us financially heal as communities. According to Arts Boston's The Art Factor 2019 report, an update to its landmark 2014 study, quote, the Arts Factor 2019 reveals that the region's art and culture sector contributes $2 billion annually to the local economy through direct and indirect spending by cultural organizations and audiences, an increase of more than 40% since 2014. It counts 21 million annual attendees to arts and culture events, more than 4 times the combined total attendance of Boston's 4 major professional teams, sports teams. It also notes that the sector generates 30,000 jobs, nearly as many as the region's retail industry. It is, end quote, it is upon us and the city of Boston to make sure that the Black art community is benefiting from the financial influx. We need a reparations commission in Boston that includes arts, culture, and history as the heartbeat that drives Black people in order to create a safe space for Black existence. We must respect the work that has been done before us and continue to push the racial resolve for Black lives. I urge you and your colleagues to move quickly to establish a commission immediately in order to show the people of Boston that it truly cares about Black lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Aziza. That was beautiful. And I'm so glad that we're getting this all in the record here, because some of my colleagues may hopefully will tune in and review this and take heed to what we're asking for. So thank you for that. I'd like to ask now Tanisha Sullivan, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. Good morning. I'm Tanisha Sullivan, president of the NAACP Boston branch, resident of the Hyde Park neighborhood of Boston. I want to first thank you, Councilor Mejia and Councilor Bach, for your leadership in bringing this particular issue to the City Council and hopefully advancing a commission on reparations here in the city. There is certainly a sense of urgency on this issue and we can wait no longer. I also want to thank the city councilors who are with us and who have been with us today, Councilor Breeden, Campbell, Wu, Flynn, and Flaherty. We see you and we thank you for your presence, your attention, and hopefully your support on this important issue. And I'd also like to thank Yvette Modestin, Tammy Tai, Aziza Goodnight Robinson for your sisterhood and leadership. I want to, in this moment, just put forward a quote by Anna Julia Cooper, who I believe, a quote that I believe really captures the work that you all do and are doing in this space. Only the Black woman can say, when and where I enter, in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special patronage, then and there, the whole race enters with me. And this work, in and through you, really captures the spirit of that quote. It is my honor to serve with you. I'll provide brief remarks and look forward to our dialogue on this issue. But first, I just want to, for the record, speak a little bit about the NAACP. For over 112 years, the NAACP has served as one of the most effective civil rights and racial justice organizations in our country. The NAACP Boston branch is the oldest chartered branch in the association and has an incomparable legacy within the association. We are a multiracial organization, and we are clear-eyed in our focus on advancing equity in education, economic opportunity, climate justice, criminal justice, health equity, and voting rights. Here in Boston, we do so by being data-driven, strategic, and laser-focused on advancing racial equity public policy. The impact of our work is experienced across the city of Boston in institutions like the Boston Public Schools, the Boston Police Department, the Boston Housing Authority, as well as in the private sector. It can be seen in public policy, from supplier diversity to educational equity to policing reform to healthcare access. As we've engaged in our work, it has become clear that our city is evolving. We are becoming a better city, but we are still held back by generations old systemic challenges that are rooted in racism. To be clear, this is not the Boston that my maternal great-grandmother and great-grandfather experienced as a biracial couple in the early 1900s. Nor is it the Boston that my family experienced in the 1950s and 1960s in Columbia Point. And it's certainly not the Boston that my dad knew as a BPS educator in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. We have progressed, but we have not been successful in addressing the complicated relationship between the Black American community and the city of Boston writ large. The impact of that reality is seen in the numbers of Black Americans who are choosing to leave Boston, a place so many of us have called home for generations. In my own family, indeed, we have seen the worst of this city, but we've also seen the best of this city. My maternal aunt owned several businesses here in the city of Boston in the mid-1900s. And 2 weeks ago, I was honored to stand outside of Nubian Square and witness the groundbreaking for the statue of General Edward Gurdine, a brigadier general in the Army, an Olympian, a scholar, and the first Black and Indigenous person to be appointed to the Massachusetts Superior Court in 1958. General Gurdine was my great-granduncle. The truth is, as Black people, we have a rich legacy in Boston. Every generation has contributed to making this city better and stronger. This, even when the road was not clear and opportunities were hard to come by as we were stifled under systemic racism. Black Boston is a cornerstone of this city. When my mother moved to an apartment in Brockton in the 70s, it was for the same reason that many Black families have flocked out of Boston today, for places like Brockton and Randolph and Stoughton. It's about opportunity, affordability, and access. In Brockton, my parents were able to buy their first home, and my mother was able to launch 2 very successful business ventures. One, a family daycare system, and the other, the Black Pages of New England. Both businesses allowed my family to work toward America's promise that if you work hard, the next generation will do better than the previous. But that is not the reality for far too many Black families in Boston. Families should not have to leave this city to find economic opportunity. As Americans and those seeking a better life in this country, we all want the same thing: to work, enjoy the fruit of our labor, and set the next generation up for success. This city has indeed been good to many and is trying to be intentional about inclusion and belonging. We have a vibrant immigrant community. We've seen women's advancement begin to take flight in the city. Our LGBTQ brothers and sisters have a rising voice and influence in our city, but our Black community, despite our generations of work, commitment, and belief, has yet to experience the full benefit of being Bostonians. Dr. Kamara reminded us about the 2015 Fed study, citing the wealth disparity experienced by Black Bostonians. And there is more data available to us demonstrating this crisis that exists relative to economic opportunity. We need more time with Dr. Kamara. In 2020, the Boston branch commissioned a report by Dr. James Jennings. That report includes solutions for the challenges, some of the challenges that exist for Black Boston, like the staggering unemployment rate, staggering disparate unemployment rate for Black Bostonians at about 13.2%, according to the 2014-2018 ACS report. Child poverty rate, the highest among any racial and ethnic demographic at 9.7%. And certainly the data that shows that Black children have some of the highest performance disparities in literacy and math in the Boston public schools. And we know that Black business owners have been systematically shut out of contracts across this city, receiving less than 1% of the city's business. This does not happen by accident, and it is not a coincidence. Although much research has been done on Black Boston, we need to invest time in studying this history together. We need to invest time focusing on this history so we can understand it better, not with malice or aggression, but with open hearts and a desire to heal. If we want our city to not only prosper, but to thrive for all of us, then it is time for all of Boston to lean into and support our collective understanding of the root causes of the ongoing disparities impacting the Black community, many of which can be traced back to our relationship with the slave trade and the enslavement of Black people. As I began my comments, I'll close. The NAACP is data-driven in our work. And we believe that to help us heal and advance as a city, we must collectively seek to understand our Boston's history and involvement in the enslavement of Black people, not to hold us back, but to spring us forward as a city. Therefore, the NAACP Boston branch fully supports the establishment of a reparations commission focused on truth, healing, justice, and repair. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanisha. As for those who are tuning in, I think that we are just laying down the foundation for what restorative and reparations is going to look like here in the city of Boston. I'm incredibly encouraged by all of this and grateful for your leadership in this space. I'm going to now turn it over to Tammy Tai. You now have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Mejia and Councillor Bach, for your leadership in hosting this conversation. I'll join my sisters, Tanisha, Yvette, and Aziza. Thank you for your sisterhood and your partnership. My name again is Tammy Tai. I'm a resident of Dorchester, representing King Boston. We're a nonprofit working closely with the city to create a living memorial and programs honoring the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. I would like to add a perspective now on the topic of education, a key issue for King Boston, and particularly given my history as an elementary school teacher. NCOBRA identifies education as one of 5 key injury areas suffered by African people before and after enslavement. The denial of the right to training began in bondage, with criminal punishment upon any individual who learned or helped that individual to study. Government-sanctioned support for double, separate, and inconsistent education from post-slavery to the present resulted in subpar training. And in Boston, a legacy of city-sanctioned policies and practices continues to disproportionately harm Black students today, producing and maintaining an apartheid educational system for our Black students. In 2019, only 25% of the city's 3rd to 8th grade Black students were reading at grade level, compared to 62% of white students. And 21% of Black students met or exceeded expectations on the math MCAS, in contrast to 62% of white students and 73% of Asian students. These large performance gaps have devastating consequences. Students who are not proficient readers by 3rd grade are 4 times less likely to graduate high school. And as of last year, there was a 9.3% 4-year high school graduation gap between white and Black BPS students. This gap has profound consequences for Black students' life outcomes and economic well-being, costing over $1 million in lost income for Black non-grads and over $4 million if they had gone on to earn a college degree. These troubling racial disparities are perpetuated by a stark resource and opportunity gap, undergirded by a segregated and unequal school system, which Boston's Black community has struggled against for over 150 years. In 1849, Benjamin Roberts filed the first desegregation suit after his daughter Sarah was denied access to a Boston school because she was Black. The state Supreme Judicial Court upheld the city's right to have separate but equal schools for Black and white children. This racist doctrine was later cited as a main precedent in the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson case 46 years later, which we heard about earlier, a decision which was used to promote segregation in all aspects of U.S. civil life up to the mid-20th century. The Supreme Court's 1954 ruling in Brown v. Board of Education that separate schools for Black and white children were inherently equal set the stage for desegregation battles in many cities, including right here in Boston. Throughout the 1960s, Black community leaders filed court litigations, testified at school committee hearings, organized marches and sit-ins at Boston school committee offices, and periodically boycotted public schools for grossly unequal school conditions. For many years, the Boston School Committee repeatedly rejected the existence of even de facto segregation in Boston schools and opposed the Black community's demands for quality education, blaming any racial isolation solely on housing segregation. And in 1972, our chapter of the NAACP filed a federal class action lawsuit to show that much in the same way that housing had been deliberately segregated through redlining, the school committee had deliberately maintained an apartheid school system through a host of mechanisms. The plaintiffs, through extraordinary labors requiring tedious and extensive documentation, prevailed. And in his ruling, U.S. District Court Judge Arthur Garrity stated, the defendants, the Boston School Committee, have knowingly carried out a systematic program of segregation affecting all of the city's students, teachers, and school facilities, and have intentionally brought about and maintained a dual school system. Therefore, the entire school system of Boston is unconstitutionally segregated. In other words, our city segregation was not accidental, it was both a choice and a plan. And as many of us know, and some listening today experienced, Judge Garrity issued an array of court orders aimed at desegregation, one of which was busing. And the resistance to Garrity's desegregation ruling in white neighborhoods was protracted and often violent. But despite violent resistance, substantial progress was made around school desegregation in that era. However, over the last few decades, a series of court decisions, misguided government policies have led to increased resegregation of Boston students of colors into high poverty, low performing schools. As recently as 2019, 77% of Black students and 2/3 of all students of color in Boston attended intensely segregated, high poverty schools, which received $1,000 less funding per student when compared to schools with lower concentration of students of color. This lapse back to old patterns is stark. In 1980, only 2% of the city's Black students attended such schools, which had been reduced from 25 to 3. We now have 84 intensely segregated schools. Our poor track record around the education of our Black children is deeply disturbing, as there is more research than ever documenting both the negative impacts of segregated school settings and the positive impacts of integrated learning environments on Black children's educational opportunities, achievement levels, post-secondary success, and life outcomes. As we've been hearing, the call for reparations has strengthened over the last year as our country reckons with the legacy of slavery laid bare over these past 18 months. And we know that Dr. King would stand with us in our fight to right centuries of harm in our nation and Commonwealth, as reflected in this 1967 statement. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps. But it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself up by his own bootstraps, and many Negroes by the thousands and millions have been left bootless as a result of all these years of oppression. So I join with others that you've been hearing today, encouraging the Boston City Council to establish a local commission for further study of the ongoing impacts of slavery and Jim Crow segregation towards the design of a Boston reparations program. King Boston is also working on a comprehensive harm report that provides deeper analysis around all the topics that have been discussed this morning. We look forward to sharing that report with you, offering any other research support as you continue exploring reparations. Thank you again for your commitment and leadership around this very important and timely conversation.
Thank you, Tammy, for your beautiful presentation and remarks. I also just wanted to make note, Dr. Tia Martin, I know you're gonna be up next, but before we move, I've been advised that Selena Barrios Milner needs to leave at 11:45, which is really unfortunate, but would want to make sure that you get, Selena, you have an opportunity to be heard. And I'm just hopeful that the administration, as we continue to move in this conversation, recognize the importance of being here in community and listening and being able to participate fully in the question and answer portion of it. So unfortunately, you won't be here for the questions, but wanted to at the very least, make sure that you have an opportunity to speak here today with us. So Selena, you now have the floor.
Thank you so much, Councilor Mejia. I'd actually like to hear from Dr. Martin first, and I'll make sure I want to hear her perspective, and then I'll share mine.
So I hope that means that you might be able to stay for a few questions then, right? Can you be a little bit late to your 11:45? I'm just saying. Okay. Putting pressure on you here. Okay, so thank you for your grace, and Dr. Martin, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. Thank you to all the organizers, Yvette Modestine of Encuentro Diaspora, Tammy Tai of King Boston, as well as Aziza Robinson. Good night. Just wanted to, for the sake of time, thank you to everyone else who's here. Thank you to the panelists who have shared thus far and who have yet to testify. In terms of, for context, I was born and raised in Boston. This is my home. My husband and I have 5 kids, all raised here in the city, 2 still at home. And so my experience in this city is not unique to other Bostonians, Black Bostonians who were born and raised here, in the sense of trying to struggle through the mixed signals that we get from our city, the mixed signal that somehow where we stand with you as Black people, we see your pain, we see your plight, we're learning the history, we want to change, and at the same time continuing to take actions that are harmful to Black people. That's a hard place to be as a Black Bostonian who is trying to figure out where we're going with all of this, right? And what I will share is that throughout my work history, starting in the private sector and nonprofit world, before coming into government through the federal government, I started out as working for the U.S. Air Force, active duty, assigned to the National Security Agency as a Serbian Croatian linguist. And even in that top secret space, where it was very rigid and all of those pieces, there were lots of policies and behaviors that were anti-Black. including what was written in the policy at the time. I had dreads or locks. And technically, I was out of compliance with the U.S. Air Force's guidance. And so my very existence as a Black person was targeted by policies, in which didn't change until recently in the last several years. So that spills down into later experiences in government working at the local level. So at the local level, now we're talking about kind of working, seeing the Boston Police Department, seeing the Mayor's Office of Emergency Management, Boston Public Health Commission, and later helping to set up the Mayor's Office of Resilience and Racial Equity. And in being able to witness the ways that our current government structure does not acknowledge the Black experience, the real challenges at the root of our historical context that most people don't know, as many folks have said. We don't learn it in school, so of course people don't know, including people who look like us. And so this idea of having a reparations commission is, I'm optimistic. I support it. And I'm also a bit cautious. And here's why. Because when we put all of the cards in the hands of government and we don't start collaboratively, what ends up happening is that people make decisions in closed door rooms that they think are best for folks. And it doesn't matter if you're a Black person and you're in a room. There's a diversity of experiences and perspectives across the Black community, which means that we actually have to engage with communities and not just representatives from communities that we usually go to. We actually have to have a community-wide process in order to really do this well. The second piece is to acknowledge that there's a level of betrayal that people have experienced with government. And so where we usually start is to ask people why you're so upset, why you're so angry. And that is the wrong place to start. Because people have a right to be upset and angry and frustrated with the consistent betrayal trauma they've experienced. That is a real thing. It is called betrayal trauma. And it is when an individual or an institution or series of institutions that we depend on for our very survival and livelihood and well-being betray us. And in the case of racism, we're constantly being betrayed by people and organizations with which we have no choice but to interact with. And so when we think about how that plays out in real life and where we have opportunities, so number one, there is this, what is explicitly called betrayal blindness. This idea that we just don't see, we don't know, we don't remember all of the atrocities that Black people experience, including the day-to-day paper cuts of microaggressions or the little slick things people say that are harmful to our well-being, and as well as kind of these more systemic structural experiences that are not just historic or throughout history or historical rather, but are still happening today, like today, yesterday. Today, someone is having an experience as a result of bad policy. And so this, for us to move forward and to really do this well, there has to be that community process. And to help people understand that history, because it wasn't that long ago. We're talking about, approximately 160 years ago, right? Just under 160 years ago, which I sat in a room with 5 generations of my own family, and I was one hug away from slavery in that room. My great-great-grandmother was a sharecropper and her parents were enslaved. And I sat in the room across all generations, listening to the stories of how she grew up and how her parents grew up. So the idea that it's so long ago is a bit of a farce, particularly when you look at the bigger context of the history of our country and other countries for that matter, where people are dealing with things from thousands of years ago. So that said, I wanna land here with this idea that Armani brought up this piece around this thread between slavery and today. And I want to be explicit about the thread so that when we're having these conversations that we're anchored in a position of not leading with deficit-based things. So the thread is really about the ideas of Black people, right? The ideas that justified slavery, that continue to perpetuate, are the same ideas, slightly remixed, right? They were deep-seated, now they've grown and kind of reformed into new things. But in essence, the same fundamental ideas about who Black people are supposed to be are the same ideas that justify present day, ongoing, federal, state, local, and organizational policies. It's used to excuse bad behavior of individuals and their individual and personal dysfunctions that target Black people. And so as we're thinking about truth and reconciliation within the context of reparations, that there's this piece of ownership of the roles that of the experiences, the negative experiences that Black people have had in Boston, the grace that we need to be extended with the pain and frustration that we're dealing with because of those experiences. And we're allowed to be frustrated, we're allowed to be upset, we're allowed to be angry because it's painful. And the goal is to come to the table and transition that pain and that anger into positive, meaningful action. But we can't do that by ourselves. There are lots of folks who are doing that in community, working hard every day, holding down their communities, who will never get the shine that some of us who are on here get. And so for us to know that there are Black people working every day to make change in their communities, but there's this larger systemic structural sets of things that are constantly in the way because we're not being honest about our individual dysfunctions and infections of these ideas and how they influence the ways that we make decisions within the context of government, and the continuation of policies that do not actually help Black people, in fact, are harmful to Black people. And what's interesting about that is the same policies that are harmful to Black people, when you swim upstream to the root of the idea that is undergirding it, it's actually harmful to Bostonians. Anytime there's dehumanization, there's a disregard for people's voice, there's a disregard for their life, that's a dangerous place that any society is headed down. Mm-hmm. For Black people and for other folks in our city. And so I'll end here with the fact that, James Brown is one of my favorites. So I'm going to refer to James Brown in what many people have heard before, but I'm going to say it again. I don't want nobody to give me nothing. Open up the door and I'll get it myself. And in the context of reparations, what we're saying and how that relates is, for me personally, I hope that we are able to open up that door for Black Bostonians so that we can get our return on investment in this city. It's not a handout. It's dues owed to people who are presently and our ancestors who never will have the chance to reap the full benefits of all that they've invested in this city and in this Commonwealth.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Martin. Thank you so very much for that. We may have an opportunity to bring you back to talk specifically around some of the health, the intersection of health here. So if time is allotted, we would love if you have the time to come back and just speak on that specifically around the health aspect of reparations in this conversation as well. Not to put you on the spot, but I may ask you to come back for a little bit on that. But in the interest of time and making sure that that we give Selena Barrios Milner an opportunity to join us this afternoon now almost, would love to call you on the floor. Selena, you now have the floor.
Thank you so much for your leadership and for your sponsorship, Councilor Mejia, and also thank you to Councilor Bach and all the counselors that have been here to listen and share their perspectives on this vital issue. I'm the Selena Barrios Milner. I'm the Chief of Equity and Inclusion, and I know that the existence of my role and my ability to do my work is thanks to the leadership of so many of you here and the community that has made equity be at the forefront of all of our conversations and discourse, and hopefully that'll lead to actual equitable outcomes for our city residents. In the Equity Cabinet, we have 8 departments that are focused in various ways on creating access, engaging community, and delivering equitable policy results for our residents. We have the Diversity Office that works on hiring and retention, the Office of Resilience and Racial Equity that I think you'll be hearing from later, the Supplier Diversity Program, and the Boston Resident Jobs Policy, to name a few. And the reason I have to jump off today and not be with you all day, which would be my dream, to be amongst just the incredible minds that are here, is that we're actually working to try to strengthen some of these programs and have a community working group to work on the resident jobs policy. And I'll just share in my experience trying to tackle these issues in the way that they present themselves that are digestible to the public. So whether it's contracting numbers or local hiring numbers, or did we find or did we not find, every layer you peel off presents multiple layers of barriers for us to move equity forward. So for example, all of the legal twists and turns you have to take to just set a goal on a contract, right? And then you go look for the businesses, and the businesses don't have the same access to capital. The business owners don't have the same access to an education that their white counterparts have. The workers that are working on our construction sites are not making the same amount of money per hour for doing the same work. And so every layer of this work leads back to the root of racism and inequity that is the foundation of not just our country, but our city. So I wholeheartedly support any efforts to directly address that and directly restore, both through truth and direct reparations, the 249 years of bondage. But the through line that all of you have mentioned, since then, we have a direct line. There hasn't been a pause or a relief in the struggle for full emancipation. We see that in the maternal mortality rate, racial wealth gap, the makeup of our prison population, the makeup of our political leadership, which thankfully is changing and every year becoming more and more representative. But we see the change, the fact that we're having this discussion today, right, is because we have now people in positions of power in academia, in city government, in community. So I just want to end that there's plenty of examples of other nations that have engaged this work. Even Germany, which doesn't come up often, has directly contributed $91 billion to survivors of the Holocaust. And that's not even adjusted to today's dollars. So we have examples from South Africa, from Guatemala, from even our own country. So it's time that we make this investment in our Black community here in Boston. I want to thank the experts and advocates and thought partners that have been here today: Jemadari Kamara, Dr. Tony Vandermeer, Armani White, Reverend Dr. Kevin Peterson, Aziza Robinson Goodnight, Tanisha Sullivan, Tammy Tai, Dr. Tia Martin, and I see you, Ms. Yvette Modestine. I want to thank you for your commitment and for your leadership, for your expertise, but also your lived experience that you bring with you to this work. And I want to thank you for your labor and hard work. And I want to make sure that if we're going to move forward with this process and we're going to model what we are talking about, I think that when we have thought experts contribute to these processes, we need to make sure that we are paying them for their time. And so I want to encourage us as we look at establishing this commission and also the Commission on Black Boys and Men, that we value the time that people are going to be contributing to this and that we build that into the model. So I really look forward to any working sessions, committing my time and my team. I know that we have our chief of staff that'll be here throughout the whole hearing, but I will be in and out pending the community working group that I'll be hosting. So thank you so much for this time, Councilor Mejia.
Thank you, Selena. So encouraged by your overwhelming enthusiasm around what we're doing here today and really acknowledging the importance of compensation. I think oftentimes we invite people to the table and expect, intellectual thought leadership and thank folks for showing up and never compensate them accordingly. So I do believe that if we're really serious about restorative justice and reparations, that what better way to do so than to honor those with their time and energy through compensation. So thank you so very much for putting that on the record, because we can just press rewind and encourage our colleagues to recognize the importance of this. So thank you for that. So in the presence of, and also just to be super mindful before I go completely off script here, we really wanted to change the way we host hearings, at least for this one, and really leading with the people. And so we're going to now open up for public testimony for this piece here, and just really want to be super mindful that we're asking people to keep their comments to 2 minutes. And I know that it's hard to do when there's so much to say, but we're really, we need to get through all of these public testimonies because we still have folks that we need to ensure that we recognize, and we still have one more panel to go. So with that being said, wanted to open up now for public testimony and the list of public testimony speakers. I also want to note that Representative Oakley is here under attendee, so want to make sure that we recognize her. And so would love to start off with our first testimony, which will be Nicholas Fayenstein, and you will definitely correct me on that spelling. So I'm asking the central staff, if you don't mind helping me out with our panel, our public testimony.
Yes, Counselor, it's Christine. I'm looking for Nicholas. I do not see him.
Okay. So I'm gonna, while we wait for Nicholas, we're gonna go to Cassandra Infante.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Counselor Mejia, and thank you, Counselor Mejia and Bach, in introducing this hearing order, and for our panel of experts and their advocacy and all of the brilliant information that they posed. My name is Cassie Infante, and I'm here today to testify on behalf of the Black Mask Coalition in partnership with King Boston and the New England chapter of NCOBRA. And so the Black Mask Coalition is a statewide coalition that was convened last year directly following the murder of George Floyd, and really as a response to the subsequent calls for tangible commitments and action in honor of the Black Lives Matter movement. Ours is a coalition made up of over 15 Black and Indigenous-led organizations from across the state, from grassroots nonprofits, orgs to educational institutions. Our collective work really centers on advocacy and accountability around the Blueprint for a New World, which outlines a set of 20 racial equity and justice-oriented targets. And central to our belief in accountability is our commitment to reparations across all levels, because we view it as a systemic approach to realizing true racial justice. The ultimate goal of our coalition is to establish a Reconstruction and Rehabilitation Fund that will total no less than $1 billion before 2030, that will support local reparation efforts, and we are well on our way. The Reconstruction and Rehabilitation Fund falls within the atonement model of reparations, and that the focus of the fund is to divest money from large corporations and redistribute the money to Black and Indigenous communities in Massachusetts, affording the opportunity for the racial wealth gap to be addressed through long-term investment in Black and Indigenous-led businesses, land ownership, education, housing, and other economic drivers. One example of how this model can succeed via community engagement is Evanston, Illinois, and the reparations fund there being funded by cannabis sales. And Boston stands so much to learn from an example such as Evanston, and the urgency around this moment has never been more apparent, as our advocacy experts have really illustrated for us today. Dr. Kamara mentioned the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston study already, but I do just want to note that as well. The wealth gap that is really evidenced in that data point is an intentional product, as we've said, of racialized policies and practices, and reparations gives us the power to address this gap. Lastly, I just want to sort of highlight that throughout our country's history, the federal government has attempted to atone for discriminatory actions and historic grievances. However, slavery and other crimes against humanity towards African Americans, from the transatlantic slave trade, Jim Crow segregation, to the ongoing inequities from the myths of white supremacy and Black inferiority, all remain a historical grievance that has not been atoned for. And Boston really has the opportunity here to lead courageously in the name of racial justice. And so I'll end by saying it's long past time that Boston recognize and repair the city's history regarding slavery and our complicitness. And our coalition looks forward to seeing Boston lead this important work, supporting community engagement efforts and furthering the reparations agenda in municipalities across the state. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And just, I have been notified that I am off script. I made a mistake, sorry. I am going back to our panel 2, because would love to give an opportunity for questions for our previous panels. So I believe, Councillor Bach, I'm gonna go to you first, and this includes our previous speakers. So any questions that you have, please bring them to the floor.
Sure. Thank you so much, Councillor Mejia, and thank you to all of the speakers. That was such a rich set of comments, and so it's hard to zoom in on any one thing to ask questions about. I guess I wonder if anybody would like to speak specifically, sort of in the same direction as I asked Dr. Kamara. When you think about models that may have been used elsewhere, about really key components for using the commission, I'm very mindful of Dr. Martin's sort of caution about how do you make it a real community process? How do you not kind of turn it into a behind closed doors thing? Just if there's anything in particular that people didn't get a chance to say in their remarks that you think is going to be really important to bear in mind in the next stage. So sort of more on that. I feel like so many of the comments were about why we need this, which I think is really important to get out in the public realm. I strongly agree. So sort of asking that next stage as we think about actually getting this, what feel to you like the kind of important stakes to put in the ground around its design and commission?
So Councillor Bach, Tanisha, Sullivan, NAACP Boston, appreciate the question, and it is an important one to be answered. We actually have in panel 3, Sister Yvette Modestin will be providing really some deep insight about the various models that exist and where we may go potentially as a city on this. So I might, unless Yvette, you feel otherwise, might defer that question to your panel, your expert testimony on that issue.
Yeah, so I think to
that makes sense, Tanisha.
Yeah,
and I'm happy to hold it till then.
Yeah, actually, do you mind? I'm going to do things out of order. I think that it's important for us to, Yvette, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump you up to now, because I think it's important for us to set the stage for what this looks like before we continue with public testimony and lay down the foundation for this work. So I'm going to move you up instead of panel 3. I'm going to bring you right now. Do you mind? I'm sorry.
No, I don't mind. I was supposed to be panel 3, so that's good. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon. Giving thanks to those whose shoulders we stand on. Greetings to all the city councilors who have joined us. Greetings, a special greetings to Councillor Mejia and Councillor Bach for bringing this forth. To the team, Tanisha, Tammy, and Aziza, much respect. This is our time, reparations now. My name is Yvette Modestin. I'm the founder and director of Encuentro Diaspora Afro here in Boston, where we center Blackness in the Latino conversation. We create bridges of understanding between Latinos and African Americans, and we raise the vibration of the African diaspora. I am also a NAARC commissioner, National African American Reparation Commissioner, which was convened by the Institute of the Black World 21st Century, and a proud member of the Codman Square NDC organizing team. I'm also ambassador for reparations and Pan-Africanism for the Rastafari Alliance of Panama, and the co-founder of ARAC, which is a regional council of Afro-descendants of Latin American and the Caribbean reparations branch. So I bring you greetings, and I want to start with, go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, so sorry, Yvette, I was just hoping that if you could answer the question,
okay,
the context, and then we'll come back to you for the for your
okay.
question.
So what the question was, Councillor Bach, do you mind repeating your question?
Sure. I mean, again, I would defer to you and Councilor Mejia on how you want to structure. I guess just really, what are if we in this room right now take for granted that this is something that we should be doing, what are the key things that we need to keep in mind in sort of setting up a commission and making sure it's going to be inclusive enough and center the right voices and just sort of models and design?
Well, one of the main models that was recent was led by Governor Gavin Newsom, who appointed 5 people to the newly task force in California. And their proposal included 9 members of the task force that included both government and community and education and anthropologists and institutions. And today, when Tanisha, Tammy, Aziza, Julia and I, when we were thinking about putting this together, we were bringing forth the same energy of the creation of the California Task Force. As you saw, we had 2 our stellar historians that are here in Boston, in our Boston institution at UMass Boston, both Professor Jamadari Kamara and Dr. Vandermeer, both doctors are members of the Africana Studies Department at UMass Boston. So the California model, the task force will inform Californians about slavery and explore ways the state might provide reparations. Its members will meet over the next year and conclude their work with a written report along with recommendations which will be provided to the legislation. The bill in creating the task force is required that it has an expertise and the civil rights and the community all involved. Each community task force begins with an hour of community testimony, which allows members of the public to share their thoughts and opinions. And I can't say how important that is. As a NAARC commissioner, I've had the honor to travel all around the country and sit and hear community testimonies from folks in Atlanta and New Orleans and New Jersey and Newark. So the community needs to be engaged in this conversation because the community has a different reality that some of us may see on a daily basis. I learned 2 things, and I want to put it into context of why I think this is important. My years in doing this work here in Boston, I was definitely shaped by the 2 men that you heard open up this conversation. But City Councilor Chuck Turner, for the years that he sat as a city councilor, I sat on his District 7 community roundtable, and I was floored by Saturday mornings, snowing, thunderstorms, and he did his meetings every Saturday at the White Church. And no matter what the weather, the community came. No matter what the situation, the community came. So we need a space for the community to come to speak and share their stories. We need to hear the community's reality. Boston is in a majority minority state, but still living in slave type narration mentality that doesn't create an open space for Black community to see equitable outcomes in all spheres of our lives.
Thank you.
So do you want me to continue, or do you want to do more testimony and then come back?
No, we're going to go to some more questions. And I would also like to have an opportunity for to open up the floor for Tanisha or other folks that have spoken to ask some questions too. Councilor Brock, if you don't mind entertaining that flow. So I'm just curious if any of my colleagues who have been leading on this front have any specific questions that they'd like to offer in this moment in time.
So Julia, just to be clear on our floor, are we going to do more testimonies and then come back, because we have sort of the proposal around models and next steps that we are proposing. So how do we want to go?
So from what I'm understanding, we're going to do questions, and then we're going to get some testimonies.
Yep.
And then we're going
to close out.
Yep. And we still haven't heard from the administration, so we need to also bring them into it.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay. Any other questions that folks want to bring into the space before we move on?
Counselor?
Yes.
So the one piece, I don't know if there are other counselors who are still with us who have questions, but the one piece that we did not touch on that is critically important to this conversation is health equity. And specifically really calling out the direct impact of the social determinants of health on the Black community here in Boston. This is well documented. Certainly the Boston Public Health Commission has done tremendous work in this space. In fact, is one of the national models on this particular issue. But I do think that as we move forward in this work, it will be critically important for us to hear from many of the experts. Many of them are here in Boston on the topic of public health, specifically social determinants of health, and the adverse impact of those on the Black community, and how some of the systemic public policy decisions that we've made have contributed to the disparities that folks are experiencing, and of course, what we need to do to repair that harm.
Thank you for that, actually, Tanisha, President Sullivan. And so Councilor Mejia called me out for not actually speaking to some of those issues. So thank you, Councilor Mejia, and thank you for Tanisha Sullivan for bringing that up. And my apologies, Tanisha, for leaving you out of thank yous from earlier in terms of folks who organized this. So my apologies for that, as well as Councilor Bach. So just to be very explicit, no matter which determinant of health you look at, whether it's housing, income, wealth, kind of infrastructure available or not available in communities, and the resultant health outcomes, when you start to look at asthma, heart diseases, different types of heart diseases, when you start to look at the issues with diabetes, and the whole range of health issues, they disproportionately burden the Black community in Boston. We used to do Health of Boston reports every year or every other year. If you go look now, we haven't done one since 2019 or 2018, which means that we haven't necessarily kept up with some of the as a city, from a public health perspective, haven't necessarily documented kind of how the evolution of some of those health disparities, health inequities have been playing out in Boston without doing additional research. So as we think about moving this commission forward, that would be an important part of this, is to be able to do that next Health of Boston report, so that we can actually see how all of that data connects around the actual health outcomes that people are experiencing in communities, and being able to connect the dots back to both the systemic and structural racism that people are experiencing in terms of access to healthcare and jobs and things like that, as well as the day-to-day experiences that Black people go through that also impact their health in the workplace, as well as the day-to-day indignities that folks experience while they're trying to navigate their lives. So thank you for bringing that up, and I am going to stop talking now.
Thank you for that. And then again, Councilor Mejia, thank you for the opportunity just to, again, kind of put some additional things into the space. You know, we have, through our planning, tried to be very intentional about using this time to put on the record those areas that we believe need to be part of the conversation in this work moving forward. The other area is, of course, in the space of public health, public safety, which is tied to the public health piece, and just thinking specifically about violence and trauma in our communities, and the relationship between law enforcement and the Black community here in Boston. We know historically the origins of policing in our country. And as the first police department in the country, Boston is certainly not immune to much of the structural racism that we see borne out in other parts of the country, knowing that the origins of policing in our country come from the slave trade and the recapture of enslaved people. And again,
we have to dig into that history, recognizing that we here in Boston have the very first established police department in our nation. What impact has that had on our community, and what impact and what might the repair and reconciliation need to be? So again, another area of focus that we did not, from a panel standpoint, go deep into, but certainly as part of this work going forward is an area that we need certainly to explore. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So I want to just make sure that I am following the lead of those who got us here, which are the women that you've been hearing most from. So I guess what I think we're going to change things a little bit around. And I'm going to ask Yvette to shake her head if this sounds right to you, but with any confirmation from my co-pilots here that we're gonna move on to having Yvette start off with her presentation. Does that sound good? If y'all can give me a verbal.
You know, we didn't communicate. I'm not sure because we went off, but I really, the whole point of I'm closing is the models, but we wanted to give the community an opportunity to speak, and community has been sitting with us for the last 2 hours. I want to honor that we really wanted that to be a part of our process so that that reality would be heard. So I would love to open it up for the community testimonies as planned. I will capture and listen as we go to be able to close out and highlight the community testimonies in our closing remarks. So you know, this is about the community. So let's hear, we are community, but let's all go even deeper. Let's hear it from our community that took the time to be with us today.
Yes. So do you see how we're modeling behavior and what it looks like to step to the side and let our community lead? So thank you for that guidance and direction. So let's do just that, which is what I initially started doing, that I had to derail the whole conversation here. So let's go to, I believe we're going to Cindy Alexis Scott. Christine, if we can allow Sydney to come on in, and then we're going to be followed by Michael Curry and then Reggie from boston@gmail.com. That's what I have. So let's line up those three, and then we can keep the conversation moving. So Cindy, I hope I'm saying it right. You now have the floor.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Sydney Scott, and I am a senior at Columbia University, and I am here today to advocate for reparations for Black and Indigenous Americans on behalf of the Amendment Project, which is an organization that mobilizes young people and students to advocate for reparations. So I will just be quick. It's been an absolute honor to hear the remarks today. And I am really grateful for the opportunity to add my remarks to what has already been shared. Efforts by Black and Indigenous Americans to accumulate wealth have been systemically thwarted by government policies directly or through government endorsed violence throughout all of history. For most of the 16th century, the majority of enslaved people in New England were Indigenous people, and that shifted in the 18th century when there was more access to the African slave market. And today, Boston, you know, it's been said before, it can be said again, the average net wealth for white households is $247,000, and the average net wealth for Black households is just $8. And it is not because we're not working hard enough, it is because there have been compounding effects of systemic racism that have never been comprehensively acknowledged and rectified. And the lineage of racial inequality is temporally ubiquitous. We can't sequester slavery as a violent tragedy of the past without acknowledging what it spawned, which is redlining and predatory mortgage loans and education systems that were segregated both by law and in practice. And so the last thing that I'll add is that this advocacy is also personal. My grandfather owns the oldest Black-owned pharmacy in the country. He was born in 1930. He didn't have a pair of shoes until he was at the age when I was studying long division in school. And he was very lucky. He was hardworking, but he was lucky. He had access to white wealth. And
I am essentially living proof of what is possible when Black people are given the opportunity to accumulate the wealth needed to take care of their families. And I am an exception when I should be the rule. So pursuing reparations is a long process. It cannot and will not be done in one iteration, and it has to include the voices of the demographic of people that it is meant to benefit, but it is long overdue. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have been advised that Isa X, which I'm not sure if that's Isabella DePina, has a hard stop. She's going back to class at 12:15. So if there's someone here lined up with the name of Isa X, I believe, if we don't mind jumping the line here really quick, you now have the floor. I believe.
Yep. All right. My name is Isabel DePina. I am the president of Public Higher Education Network in Massachusetts. I was raised in Boston. I am a voter. I am active in my community. In foreclosure, I am very invested in urging for racial equity in Boston. Please accept this statement for the public record regarding Doc 0734. Our Black communities deserve reparation due to the fact they have disadvantage in this American system. An example that they deserve reparation is they were slaves of this country, forced to work free labor, and now we stuck in the system that wasn't meant for us. I am a low income and a single mother of two, and I want my children not to go through the system that wasn't meant for them. I am getting my labor study BA and my master in conflict resolution, not only to fight for justice, but to make wealth for my children and granddaughter. I can't transfer any wealth to my children. Please be a role model for other cities and states to make sure our Black communities get reparation. If we are practicing anti-racist, the city in a whole need to build trust, restructure the school system because of its racial disparities. Our Black communities need wealth and respect from their city and states. One example for reparation is also to support the Debt-Free Future Act, Bill H1339, because it's part of reparation. I urge you and your colleagues move quickly to establish this commission. And I am a supporter of the NDC. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Isabella. It's always great to see you and hear you. So I'm gonna move on to now Michael Curry, previous president of the NAACP and longtime champion of all things racial equity.
Thank
Michael,
you, Counselor. It is an honor and a privilege to be here to see you, my friend, and to the many others who testified this morning, and appreciate the hearing and the conversation this morning and this afternoon. The hearing on reparations is timely. As some of the folks on the call know, 2019, after being an African-American studies student in college, was invited to do a presentation on reparations for a synagogue in Boston. That presentation so inspired me that it became a journey of mine since 2019 to do a presentation I now call Quantum Leap, the story of anti-Black racism in America from 1619 to today. And a large part of that presentation is the data, the arguments, the research around reparations. I've been doing that presentation pretty much 3 times a week for the last 2.5 years. Every major hospital system in this state, every many nonprofits. I did it for the UK just last week. What is revealed to me is that how few people know American history. Not only how many white folks don't know American history, but how many people generally, including African Americans, don't know American history. So I'm going to just take a few seconds, as I know we're limited in time, on what's covered here. Carter G. Woodson, the founder of Negro History Week, which we now know as Black History Month, reminded us that history was not the mere gathering of facts. The object of historical study is to arrive at a reasonable interpretation of the facts. So during that presentation, I talk about nearly 4 million slaves with a market value estimated to be between 3.1 and $3.6 billion lived in the US just before the Civil War. And masters enjoyed a rate of return on those slaves comparable to other products like cotton. We don't often recognize the value of slaves. As we're having this debate in Congress right now around a stimulus bill, $1 trillion, $3 trillion. We're talking about 19th century dollars and 4 million slaves and the market value of those slaves. I think it was Tony Vandermeer who said earlier, when he was talking about the value of slaves and the benefit of Massachusetts, I'm going to offer up a homework assignment to those on the call today to read a book called Slavery's Capitalism. So even as you, Counselor, and your colleagues are doing work in this space, I want to encourage folks to read Slavery's Capitalism, and I'm just going to read a quick excerpt. In the decades between the American Revolution and the Civil War, slavery as a source of cotton that fed Rhode Island's mills, as a source of wealth that filled New York's banks, as a source of markets that inspired Massachusetts manufacturers, proved indispensable to national economic development. Slave-grown cotton was the most valuable export of the US and one of the few American-made goods that attracted specie. Money in the form of coins rather than notes is the definition of that. So I walk through what redlining is and give the history of redlining. I walk through who got banked in this country, and people have often cited the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston's report, but there are federal reports that we need to look at as well around reparations. The average net worth per capita among white Americans is roughly $437,000 per person, whereas the value is $105,000 among Black people and $53,000 among Hispanic people. According to data from the Federal Reserve in 1990, white households own 90.7% of household wealth in the United States, whereas Black households owned 3.8 and Hispanic households own 2.1. We talk about who got banked. It's really important to unpack those numbers. I will say this just quickly, Counselor. When I do this presentation across the country, I started this way. I'm a kid of Roxbury, born at Boston City Hospital, raised in Lenox Street housing projects, then moved up to Quincy Street, Townsend Street area during the 80s and 90s. I tell people when I walked out my door, whether it was Lenox Street or Blue Hill Avenue, I saw large numbers of African-American men being incarcerated, arrested and incarcerated. Almost all of my uncles and aunts had diabetes and heart disease and cancer and died at higher rates, living 5, 10, 15 years less. We saw murder in our communities at high rates. When we went downtown to go shopping, we were followed around department stores. And what that told me, Counselor, is this: what is wrong with us? That's the question. You're 5 or you're 10 or you're 15 or you're 20 in Boston. What is it wrong with us when you live in our communities and you see your people living in those conditions? Then I visited family in Birmingham. They lived the same way. Then I visited family in Atlanta. They lived the same way. I visited family in Rochester, New York. They were living the same way. And you can't help but to ask the question, what is wrong with us? And it's not until I stepped foot on a college campus and became an African-American studies student that I got the context, the importance of history, that I got the redlining, the debt peonage, the fact that even after slavery, folks found out they were not slaves, but then they were told, oh, by the way, you now owe me for the land you lived on, for the food you ate. Now you can't leave. And if you try to leave, you're going to be incarcerated. So I bring this forward to this conversation, Counselor, to say this. There is rich data and rich research around reparations, looking at Evanston and in the reparations bill that they put forward, looking at what's happened in college campuses as students have stood up across this country to call for reparations. George Washington University and others are really testaments to what can happen when there's a concerted effort to look at reparations and repositioning Black America. That's what this should be about. Repositioning Black America, long overdue.
Yes, thank you for that. And I'm going to have to, now listen, y'all, I've been very, very generous on the time situation, but I need you all to understand that we have, several other folks who have to speak, and we still have a few more panels to go. So I'm gonna have to do something that I hate doing, which is I'm gonna start doing the timer. Once you hear that, you know your time is up, and I'm gonna have to keep it moving, because otherwise we will be here until tomorrow if I don't take the reign here and try to have some sort of time management skills. So thank you, Michael, so very much for that. But I definitely want to make sure that we have time for others. So I'm going to ask the next set of speakers, and then what we're going to do is we're going to take a few more public testimonies in the spirit of leading with community, and then I'm going to go to one of our panels, and then go back to some community testimony, and then finalize it with some with Yvette wrapping us all up here. So I'm going to set the timer. I believe here on my list, if I'm correct, there's someone named Reggie who is signed up. I don't have a last name. So Reggie, if you are here and ready to speak, please raise your hand so I can find you.
I'm here.
Oh, you're here, great. So I'm gonna set the timer, Reggie.
Okay.
Okay, it's good to see you.
All right, good to see you, Counselor.
All right.
My name is Reggie Stewart. I'm a longtime Dorchester resident. I also stand in the shoes of my second great-grandmother, who was born into slavery in the state of Texas. Her given name was Hattie Stanley, and I stand in her shoes today. Thank you, Councilors Bach and Mejia, for asking how reparations should be paid and not if they should be paid. That's an important distinction. I'm glad you recognize it. Thank you in particular, Councilor Mejia, for your solidarity and engagement with the African-American community and for allowing that to inform your policymaking decisions. And it certainly informs my voting behavior. Now, while it's true that reparations and reparative actions can take many forms and has many models, any discussion around reparations for slavery and Jim Crow that does not explicitly propose a transfer of wealth to the descendants of slavery for that group's unique experience of targeted multi-generational theft is not a serious discussion. We can't ignore that the primary reason for which my ancestors were enslaved here was to extract wealth. Wealth was and continues to be plundered. The stolen wealth is still a part of our local and national economic systems and has grown exponentially over time. What has also compounded is the poverty, disinvestment, and accrued disadvantage borne on the backs of descendants of slavery. Wealth was stolen, so as a necessary reparative action, wealth must be repaid. We must not allow fear of conservative backlash to sway us from properly repaying the debt owed to our ancestors for being forced to build the wealthiest country on earth. Again, I appreciate the counselors for centering the question of reparations, and the city of Boston can and must legislate in a way that makes Boston more equitable. That said, it's critical to recognize that a project of authentic and lasting repair for the harms of slavery and Jim Crow is far beyond the capacity of any local or state government. So any actions that come out of this body should have that as a focus to put pressure on the federal government. And for an appropriate example of reparations policy, I would direct the council's members to the federal reparations framework developed by the American Descendants of Slavery Advocacy Foundation. And I urge the counselors to follow the lead of the foundation as you advocate for reparations on our behalf to the federal government. Thank you again very much, Julia, and I'll see you at the polls next Tuesday.
Okay, thank you so very much, Reggie. And thank you for trying to keep it on time. So I'm gonna move on next to Katie. Katie, you have 2 minutes. So please, you now have the floor, Katie.
Great, thank you very much, Chairwoman Mejia, Councilor Bach, and the Committee on Civil Rights for the opportunity to speak with you today, and to all the panelists for your informative presentations. My name is Katie Sanson. I'm an attorney and director of the Racial Redress and Reparations Lab at the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, or CRRJ. Based at Northeastern University School of Law and founded by Professor Margaret Burnham, CRRJ is a preeminent academic center for the study of historical redress in the United States, and our Racial Redress and Reparations Lab offers expertise in designing reparative processes and historical and legal research. CRRJ's historical research documents a pattern of racial violence and oppression that persisted long after the abolition of slavery. Our work also documents the intergenerational effects of this past and the ways families today are still affected by the loss of accumulated wealth, land, and job and educational opportunities, and by the trauma that is passed from generation to generation. Although our investigations focus primarily on the southern and border states, we know that this history is both national and local. And we've heard so powerfully today about Boston's local history of racial violence and systemic inequity. Our legal and governmental institutions played a central role in this history and must also play a central role in repair. We urge the city to proceed with a comprehensive process informed by community voices to explore and document its history and take tangible steps towards repair. As we've heard today and we'll hear later, cities and states across the country now provide a range of models from which Boston can glean important lessons, from Providence's truth-telling and reconciliation process to Evanston's reparative housing program, to all of the various commissions and task forces created in the state of California, in San Francisco, Asheville, North Carolina, and Amherst, Massachusetts. We believe that compiling a full accounting of the wrongs committed is an essential first step towards repair, and we hope that the city of Boston will continue to probe not only the city's history with slavery, but also the systemic racism and discriminatory policies and practices that have continued for decades after, and the ongoing legacies of these practices. Thank you again for your time and for your attention to this topic.
Thank you. Thank you. I should have been doing that the whole entire time, y'all. But this is such an important hearing. I really wanted people to be heard, but I got to be the timekeeper too. So thank you. We're gonna take one more public testimony, and then we're gonna move on to some of our panels, and then go back to public testimony, because we definitely wanted to center the voices of the people, and this is kind of the best way to find middle ground around that. So I'm gonna go to Mr. Siddiqui, I believe, is in the building, in the Zoom here.
Khalil Siddiq?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Hello, my name is Khalil Siddiq. I'm a community activist and racial equity consultant. I live in Chelsea, but I've lived all over the greater Boston area for the past 20 years while being heavily active in community organizing, centered on voting, immigrant rights, homelessness, poverty, and ending the system of racial discrimination. My family and ancestors descend from Georgia sharecropping. I applaud the leadership of the Boston City Hall Committee on Civil Rights for holding this important hearing, and specifically the two sponsors of this matter, City Councilor Kenzie Bach and City Councilor Julia Mejia. Thank you. We must not continue to kick the repair can down the street with commissions and hearings. The data and facts are clear. The case has been made. Repair is due, and it's a federal multi-generational project. Some scholars have estimated that Black Americans are owed between $14 to $17 trillion. American slavery and Jim Crow was a national institution, laid upon a singular lineage and legacy. The amount of money for the repair demands implementing broad transformative policies for Black Americans, and this is far beyond the capacity of any city or state body. This repair demands a national/federal framework and program. Boston City Councilors, let's have the conversation. I fully endorse the American Descendants of Slavery Advocacy Foundation's framework towards having a national reparations framework and program. The ADOS Advocacy Foundation scholarly work has convinced me that they are leaders in the space of reparation education and advocacy. I encourage all those who believe in accountability and in repair to end the legacy of systemic racism and historical disadvantages of Black Americans by tying your vote to candidates who only support a national/federal reparation framework and program. Thank you for your time and attention, committee members and viewers.
Okay, 2 minutes right on time. Good job. Okay, I'm going to move on. I've been notified that there's one more person, Sean Fuentes, and then I'm going to go on to the panel. Sean, you now have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Councilwoman Julia Mejia. I want to thank the Committee on Civil Rights. I'd like to acknowledge the esteemed panelists, some of whom are friends of mine, and a special shout out to Councilwoman Julia Mejia and Kinsey Bob for sponsoring the support piece of legislation. And my name is Sean Fonts. I'm a Black Bostonian, born and raised. I'm a lawyer, and my ancestors descend from the plantations of Virginia. I like to make 2 points here, and I like to approach this topic from a legal standpoint. Similar to what the American Bar Association noted recently, reparations is more than a moral obligation. It's a legal obligation of the United States. And when we talk about reparations, I think it's my recommendation to this committee would be to take a United States American jurisprudence approach to this and let this undergird the legislation, simply because American jurisprudence has a legal framework for reparations. Simply, this American jurisprudence simply states that where there's an act, there's a wrongdoer, there's a harm, and there's a victim, recompense should be made. And I think that with all of those elements, which are American jurisprudence elements, this should be the framework by which this committee is looking at a reparations model. Secondly, with respect to the importance of this being an American jurisprudence model, is that in some spaces, and even in the language of this legislation, there is reference to an international law. I would caution this committee in using an international law approach, because I think that history has shown repeatedly that the United States has a history of being contemptuous and dismissive of international law when the United States doesn't endorse international law policies. We recently saw that in last month during the UN Convention on Reparations. During this particular convention, the United States never appeared or never showed up to the UN to even have this discussion about reparations, because it was not a topic that the United States was interested in. So therefore, I would caution this committee from looking at an international approach. Secondly, I would make a recommendation, as I've heard earlier, in that this committee should be looking at a policy that encourages the United States to create and fund reparations. Simply being that this debt of reparations is a huge debt and is overwhelming for the capacity of a local community.
Okay, Sean, I just wanted to let you know that we are at time. So if you want to just kind of wrap up your last thought,
Yes, and my last thought would be, I would also recommend that this committee visit the website of the ADOS Foundation, which does have models and frameworks which are very critical to the issue of reparations. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you so very much. I wanted to just keep the conversation going, and I'm going to just switch things a little bit out of order here. We're going to move on to the administration. I know you guys have been so incredibly generous with your time. We'd love to give you an opportunity to participate in the panel, and then would open it up for some questions, and then move on to a little bit more public testimony, and then I'm closing out with Yvette. That is what I believe is the course of action, and we're going to move on next to the administration. So I'd like to call on our Chief Nelson. Please, you now have the floor.
Thank you so much, Councilor Bach. Can you guys hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Certainly want to thank you. Want to thank the architects who have helped you I don't mean to miss anybody, but the team that has helped to put this entire framework together. Certainly, we believe it's not only timely and overdue, in full agreement with the statements that have been mentioned thus far relative to reparations now, what reparations should look like, recognizing the daily pain, the daily struggle, and the daily impact of reparations and what it has caused and what it continues to do for our people, in addition to some of the advancements that we have made as a people going forward. Our office is the Office of Race, Resilience, and Equity. I serve as the chief here. Our work is embedded in trying to dismantle some of these systems that have been mentioned by previous speakers and by testimony relative to systemic race matters. Some of the work that we try to do really focuses on 3 Ps, policy, program, and practice, and how it is that we shift the culture and the mindset and the practices that serve the very people who we are all committed to serving in the city of Boston. I am, again, very grateful to be a part of this conversation. I most definitely want to thank you, Councilor Mejia, and certainly Councilor Bach, for being bold and courageous and for putting this together at this time and in this space that we are in the city of Boston. Our office, in addition to, of course, our chief, Barrios Milner, and the Office of Equity, stand in support of what will come out of this commission and what will come out of this great work together. We offer our support and our working with you as you mold this and shape this for the communities that we serve. I certainly am very interested in hearing what the next steps will be and how to plug and play and be an intricate part of how that will move forward. And I do apologize as I may have to step off a little early, but to Dr. Modestine, I'm so sorry. I definitely want to hear the recommendations going forward, because I do believe that certainly some of the work we have done and will continue to do will help bring this city to the place that we need it to be. Last thing I'll say, Councilor, is that I want to certainly give honor to King Boston and some of the other persons on this call who we are tied and locked at the hip with relative to this work moving forward in community and for the people we serve. And thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Lori. And I need you to go drink some tea or something, okay? We need your voice in that space. So I'm going to now move on to Jessica. You now have the floor.
Hi, Counselor. I also work along with Chief Nelson, and I yield my time for anyone else. Thank you.
Okay, that's okay. I appreciate that. You just saved us some time here. So I'm looking at Yvette, Tammy, and Tanisha, and Aziza shaking your heads. I'm going to move back to some public testimony and then go to Yvette. See how they're leading me, y'all. I just want you all to know who's running this show. I'm just doing what I'm told here, okay? So I'm gonna move back to public testimony. And so I just wanted to just give you all a list of who I have on deck so that you can get yourself camera ready. I believe we have Alexandria, Dania, Sheila, Marinetta, Cash, Amara, and then Cam Howard, I believe it is. Those are the next list of folks who are lined up to speak. So if central staff could bring them into the space, that would be great. And remember, I got the timer. So I'll just let you know you got 2 minutes, and then we're gonna keep it moving. So I'm going to ask Alexandra, is I believe in the waiting room. We don't see them in the waiting room. Okay. Dania, Francis.
Hello, that's me.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So first, I'd like to say thank you, Councilor Mejia and Councilor Bach, for the opportunity to offer public testimony and for holding hearings on this important topic. Thank you to the panelists for the education they have provided this morning. My name is Dania Francis, and I'm a Boston resident and a descendant of ancestors who were enslaved in Alabama and Mississippi. I'm also an assistant professor of economics at UMass Boston and have studied the topic of economics of reparations for African Americans for nearly 20 years. Today, I'd like to stress the importance of synergies between local reparations initiatives and the larger national push for federally backed reparations, which Dr. Kamara touched on during his testimony. Estimates of the dollar amounts necessary to fund reparations for African Americans broadly are orders of magnitude larger than local jurisdictions would be able to finance alone, and would therefore require a federally backed national movement. However, local reparations initiatives, in addition to all of the local benefits they provide, can also be an important part of a national reparations movement, in that they, one, energize and educate the public on the case for reparations, and some of that work has already begun today. They help build a nationwide networked infrastructure of local reparations movements. They ally with local elected officials who may later hold state and national elected positions. And finally, in the spirit of Dr. Martin's testimony, they can help support and create community-based entities whose aims are to help direct reparations-based capital into Black communities and out of the hands of the discriminatory banking infrastructure. And so local reparations initiatives have both the potential to be reparative for local communities, as well as synergistic with national reparations movements when thoughtfully conceived. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And I also want to acknowledge that you are a doctor, Dr. Francis. So I just want to make sure that we put that respect next to that name. So thank you so very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
So I'm going to move on now to Sheila. I believe, Sheila, you are here with us? Or not? Going once, going twice. Sheila, moving on to the next. Okay. Marinetta Patterson, if you're here, please, you now have the floor. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Okay, moving on to Cash Gaines. If you are here, please, you now have the floor.
Check. Yeah, what's good, y'all? Thanks for having me. I'm gonna try to speak a little fast with that 2-minute timer, yeah. First, I want to say that in studying reparations and playing chess, I often think of strategy. I don't watch sports or any of the distractions. Reparations to me is my inheritance for unpaid labor and my land denied. Some could argue $6.2 quadrillion. Some figures we have to have in another conversation. That's federally. I want to say first that thank you guys for having this meeting. We need to know that reparations in Evanston was a survey of an either or, housing, education, or healthcare, in my understanding. We ain't doing that with reparations anymore. It needs to be yes and. It needs to be 800 credit score resets for every Black American, protected class status, the N-word's a hate crime, federal investigations for lynching. We need dividends and lifetime payments from the Green Rush, and our 40 acres and a Tesla. We need an update to 40 acres and a mule. That means clean energy, working with someone who already has the infrastructure. It's an American business. And I heard that in Boston, some of the layouts are a bit confusing. So full self-driving can help in the financial regions of the financial end and the historic Old West. It's true that the roads have confusing layouts in the old sections of the city, from historic downtown, the financial district, and the North End. So I'm a bit facetious, but to keep it 100%, Oregon is offering lifetime payments, $123,000 a year. We're hoping to see something like that for Massachusetts, but better, since they have an even bigger economy. Thank you guys again for the space and time.
Wow, yes, that was great. And there should be a remix underneath that. I think everybody needs to hear that 10 times fold. And so thank you for that. I'm gonna move on now to Amara Young. You now have the floor.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm out here on the work site, so I'm not really camera ready, but I'm Amaru Young, and I want to say good day to all the esteemed people of the panel. First off, I would like to say thank you for taking on this monumental process, as well as thank you for allowing the public to speak. I'm a Black American descendant of child of slavery, and I'm calling on behalf of my family members living in once that was segregated, Matapa in North Dorchester and Upper Roxbury. now steadily being gentrified. First off, I would like to suggest that the panelists take to read From Here to Equality, as well upon the expert and call upon the expertise of Dr. Darity, Professor Duke, who has written about the reparation plan for the American descendants of slaves, and to identify the people harmed with the special consideration to the Black American descendant child of slavery. And moving forward, I would suggest that this panel take into special consideration of the United Nations call to have a true reparation process, which is non-repetition, restitution, compensation, gratification, and repair. Those 5 elements is what represents a true reparation plan that will guide our people to the full status of American citizens as they should have. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that. And you did it before time, so thank you. Really do appreciate this level of specificity and timeliness. I believe we now just have one more. Cam, I believe it's how it's pronounced, Howard, and I understand you are from Chicago, but we're gonna let you live. I'm gonna let you come into the space and share your testimony with us here today. Oh, he's no longer, they are no longer, we don't see you in the room. Okay, maybe Chicago wind blew you away. So thank you for your attempt to be here with us today. So I'm gonna move on to the, are there any other members of the public looking to do testimonies? I'm going to move on now to our last panel and our closer for today's conversation is my friend and my sister in this work, who, oh, I see a hand up. Hold up, I got all excited. Sorry, Friday Jones. I see you. I saw that hand up. And in the interest of making sure we let the people speak, you up next. Go.
Thank you. And I I'm calling from out of state. I am from Brooklyn, New York. My name is Consa Jones Muhammad. I'm a commissioner for Mayor Garcetti's task force in Los Angeles. I'm the co-chair of the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants, which helped Shirley Weber push the state California bill, AB 3121, in order to have a task force for the state of California. We were able to write legislation into that bill. I'm also very passionate about Boston because my family is originally from Scotland, North Carolina. During the Great Migration, my great-grandmother and all of her siblings fled North Carolina as a result of one, their father passing away, and two, Black women being raped with impunity in Scotland Neck, North Carolina. And the two legs of my family, one leg wound up in Boston, where my family still lives. The other leg wound up in Brooklyn, New York. And so Boston is very close to my heart. One of the historians in our family, Sissy Jones, she and I talk about our genealogy, and it's very important as you all go down this pathway to really have an understanding with regards to specificity. I speak often about my genealogy. I have indigenous heritage. My indigenous people, however, have a treaty with the United States government. And I think there is room in the reparation space to actually have conversations with some of these indigenous nations about people that have fallen out of treaty with regards to being repaired, who have fallen out of being called indigenous to being called Negro, because that is part of our legacy in this country. There's also the need for specificity for the slave folks who were enslaved in this country to really be part of whatever financial repair that is going to be part of a portfolio of repairs. I think the work that has to be done nationwide is, thank you, it's important. You're doing important work, but thank you, and please continue on your journey.
Thank you. I'm so incredibly encouraged by the folks who are tuning in and bringing their voice and perspective into this space. It goes to show how important this conversation is. I see one more hand up. I believe it's Dr. Karoi. Are you from Boston? Are you also, where are you from? Because I'm gonna put, Hi, can you hear me? You
Yes.
now have the floor.
Yeah, I just want to say a word or two. My name is Dr. Karoy Ferguson. I'm actually a professor at UMass Boston and the Human Services Program Director there, as well as president of the Association for Humanistic Psychology. I'm a voter and have been actively involved in the community for many, many years, dealing with the issues of racial equity. I just wanted to kind of echo some things that have already been said. And much has been written and said about the notion of reparations as it relates to the Black community. I actually grew up in the segregated South, so I know what that means. And when I came to the Boston area, I encountered some similar kinds of things. So it's important, however, to really understand the essence of reparations. And as people have said, the essence involves comprehending the central idea of repair in terms of correcting the systemic narratives and inequities and the systemic disparate effects of those narratives and inequities on the Black community. So we've had many examples already given about the disparate effects in terms of economic inequities and disparities, income inequality, jobs, businesses, health inequalities and disparities, things like insufficient insurance coverage, legal inequities and disparities, flaws in our judicial system, political inequities and disparities, the whole effort around voting suppression, and incomplete or false narrative histories. And this is where we have incomplete history, for example, pertaining to Faneuil Hall. So correcting these inequities and disparities, therefore, is the currency of reparation compensation in real and symbolic terms. And given this perspective, reparations intrinsically means having in place strategic efforts to foster two essential ingredients, as have been implied, truth and justice. In practice, what this means is that when strategic plans and actions are developed and are guided by the visions of truth and justice, and when truth and justice are held as frameworks and impetus for planning and actions, the ultimate outcomes of implementing the plans and actions inevitably are reparations. Ultimately, however, reparation requires a profound shift in consciousness. You cannot heal or solve a problem with the same kind of consciousness that created it. Right? And therein lies the need for a reparations commission. I just humbly submit those words for the record. Also have a reparations model for strategic planning and action, which I've submitted to Christine. So that hopefully that'll be in the record also.
Thank you, Dr. Ferguson. I got my text messages were blowing up that you're one of our elders, and we definitely need to bring you into this conversation to move the work forward. So we will be stalking you soon. So very grateful for your leadership and guidance and wisdom in this space here today. So thank you for hanging on as long as you did to provide your public testimony. I also just want to note that I've been advised that State Rep Oakley is still with us here, and we need to bring her into the transfer her from, I guess she's in the attendees. If we could bring her on for her public testimony before we move on to our long-awaited final speaker, Yvette Modestine. You're closing out the show here, Yvette, just so you know, keeping everybody on there waiting here. So if State Rep Oakley is still here with us today. Please, you now have the floor.
Hi, Counselor Mejia. Thank you so much. I was just here as a listener, also descended from enslaved Africans. So while I'm a second generation Bostonian, my dad's people are from South Carolina and Virginia. My mom's people are from Alabama. And so knowing as we do that in this country, we often don't learn our history. I was really just here as a supporter and to learn more about everything that reparations involve. And as such, I have no prepared remarks. Therefore, I just want to thank everyone, you, Councilor Mejia, for convening this body, to the city councilors. I heard Andrea Campbell earlier. I see City Councilor Kinsey Bach is here. I know others joined as well. To all of the esteemed panelists through every portion of the Black and African diaspora, for sharing stories, for dropping knowledge, for giving us history, and quite honestly, giving us solutions to move forward. I want to just double click on what Mr. Fontes says about ADOS, who has done lots of research, as have so many others, on some strategies and solutions here. And just however I can be a partner at the state level, know that this is near and dear to my heart. And I am just so grateful that this conversation is officially on the record of our city. And so there can't be no questions, if, ands, or buts about it. So thank you so much to all of the panelists, the speakers, those who convened this, and to you and your office, Councilor Mejia.
Thank you so very much, Rep. And also thank you to my colleague, Kinsey Bach, Councilor Bach, for her dedication to this conversation and partnership and being here with us. And I have to say is that I know that sometimes we do have these time constraints, but I think that this conversation is so long overdue. And I'm just so incredibly grateful to Central staff for their support and helping us carry on with this conversation. So I would love to be able to now just really go on to Yvette Modestine, who has been a leader and a sister and just such an amazing force in regards to this conversation, to really close us out and share some reflections, and more importantly, the where do we go from here. All this time we've been waiting for you, and you're on mute now. Let's go. Off mute, let's go.
So thanks, Julia. Thanks, Councilor Bach. Thanks to the fabulous team of Queens, Tanisha, Tammy, and Aziza. You know, we've been texting, and I'm deeply moved, holding back tears that we've made it, the meetings that we've had, and that we're sitting here today. I want to start, by putting forth the words of Ida B. Wells: "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." And, we've been talking about this conversation from a very heavy head place, and I want to bring it to a heart place. In the years of traveling around this country and meeting people of African descent, Black people from all different walks of life, one of the things that has been a familiar vibration of all these people is that they hurt and that they're still hurting. So one of the things that I ask is we sit through reflecting on this conversation, and as we move forward in seeking reparations and creating a reparations commission in Boston, that we seek with a place of healing, uplifting, a righteous humanity of our people, and that we do no harm, and that love has to be a part of the conversation. It is also important to underline that reparations are about justice and necessary before we begin an honest conversation, dialogue about racial reconciliation. They should happen before and not after such a dialogue. Fix the broken windows of my house before we start talking about why you broke them in the first place, as said by one of my fellow commissioners, Dr. Ray Wimbush. I want to also, like Dr. Jamadara Kamara highlighted, was the work of Senator Bill Owens, who pushed forth, one of the first people in this country to put forth a reparations conversation. And now HR 40 is moving forward 30 years after Senator John Conyers has filed it. So it is time for Boston to catch up and lead in the way that it led before. In asking what is needed as we move forward in this reparations conversation and for Boston, I tapped into some of my elders who have been national spokesperson and leaders in this conversation, such as Baba Jeremiah Wright, Dr. Joyce King, Mama Joanne Watson, and Dr. Iva Carruthers. And every time I ask them what is needed, what do we need to highlight, they say spirituality. Spirituality is a foundation that needs to be highlighted and celebrated. We need to heal internally for us to then carry outside what we need that is just for us. Chuck always talked about, centering community, listening to community's voice. And that's why the Saturday morning meetings were so important. Atia spoke about the trauma of our folks, and Cuff, our elder, closed with, a shift in consciousness. I learned as one of the first group of trauma responders in the city of Boston more than 10 years ago, that even if we went in for that shooting and that homicide, that suicide, that criminal incident, that crime, that when we walked in, that was not the only conversation that we were having with our community. We then had to listen to that piece of that trauma, but then we had to hear the trauma of the housing, the trauma of the education, the trauma of the busing, the trauma of the food. All of that is part of our reparations conversation. I want to highlight a piece that was written by Dr. Ajamu Brown with one of our leading voices on this conversation of reparations, Professor James Jennings, who was not able to be with us today. And they wrote a paper last year that's called Reparations as Racially Progressive Economics. And they state that reparations can be an economic tool to both atone and mitigate the continuing impacts of historical injustices born of continual structural racial inequalities. This can occur if we think of reparations as a sort of racial progressive Keynesian economics, given the inevitable rapid reconstructing of our global economy due to the coronavirus pandemic, which has hit many working class communities of color harder than most, and the continuing inequality that led to Black Lives Matter movement. The nation now has an opportunity to seriously implement a robust reparations plan for Black Americans to address its moral responsibility for past wrongs. We've heard of the California model. We heard from a sister directly. The California model is charged with talking about informing Californians about slavery and informing ways. I think Dr. Kamara and Dr. Vandermeer started that. I think we need to expand on that. Kevin also spoke on that and the issue of Faneuil Hall. We need to pull from that. Tanisha spoke of the history of the NAACP, and Michael even touched on that. So I think we need to use Boston's own history. It is no accident, I think, that today was charged with women leading. And I wanted to pause and read from the book, Belinda's Petition, which Dr. Kamara mentioned. And it says, "It is fitting and no surprise that the first successful record of a petition for reparation in the United States was brought forward and won by an African woman. Historically, the complete and total appropriation of Black women's domestic, manual, and reproductive labor served to firmly establish the economic foundation of the United States. The use of their bodies to reproduce the slave labor pool ensured the continuing viability of the Southern slavery after the US officially abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1808 by generating a labor force perpetrated independently of the need to import new slaves from Africa. A labor force was born into the slave system as opposed to imported into it." So the other model, also in keeping the historical truth about Boston, is the Everston model, and they're using the cannabis, and cannabis is legal now in Massachusetts, and they're using the money gained through their cannabis sales to help in the funding. So the funding of the program comes from the cannabis sales tax revenue from Evanston's marijuana dispensary, as well as some of the private contribution. As of recent, the fund had nearly $100,000, though that reflected only through July and August. So that's a model too, that we can use the money, because we need to know where the money is going to come from for us to be able to really move this conversation forward. We have the models of CARICOM, which was one of the first official commissions. I sit in the model of Panama, and as some folks have mentioned, the UN model, and the UN just speaking. But I wanted to, break down the 10 points of NAARC, the National African American Commission, and then connect it to what we heard today, because I've been taking notes throughout. So the 10 points of the NAARC program that I think are important areas that in Tammy, Tanisha, and Aziza, and Julia, and thinking about, we wanted to break it down into specific areas, like the history of that area and what is the current state in Boston. So point one is the apology and the Ma'afa Institute. So there needs to be accountability, there needs to be an apology. Repatriation is number two. So creation of a model that allows for African knowledge to be led. Amari spoke very strongly about land, and he talked about how much land was owned in Roxbury and taken away by Black families in Roxbury to build highways. That needs to be repaired. Where the funds are met, who gets the funds? When we went into COVID, Atia and those leaders that were part of the Boston COVID Coalition, Black COVID Coalition, really pushed on where the funds were being set, who got the funds, and how they were going to be distributed. Health and wellness is very important. I truly believe, as a clinician, as someone who was a trauma responder in the streets of Boston, if our mind ain't right, our spirit ain't right, our movement is not going to be right. So as we talk about the external reparative justice that needs to be had, we also need the internal conversation of the health and our wellness of our being to be seen in our human light. In the recent report by the UN, led by Michelle Bachelet, ex-president of Chile, she called out this country for its lack of reparative justice. And we're still in the decade of people of African descent. And one of the highlights of that decade was reparative justice. And we saw ourselves in COVID dealing with George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, to name a few. So there is need for a reparative justice on how we are seen in our humanity. We heard very passionately from Isabel, who talked about education and our community needing to really develop education. Boston Public School has been in a real riff about the inequality and the lack of equity that exists in our schools, not only just in the education piece, but our buildings, the setup of our buildings. We've had issues with our transportation. All of that, if not dealt with, is an issue of reparative justice, is an issue of reparations. Number 7, housing and wealth and generation, which goes into the land, the info and community structure, and our sacred sites, which Kevin talked about in Faneuil Hall, and then recently they just did that. And the criminal justice system. Julia, you have been working with my colleagues, many of our colleagues, but specifically my 2 colleagues, Lee and James, from the Men's Network and Brothers Building, where we have a prison, school to prison pipeline. We have an enormous amount of Black men, Black and brown men, Black men in our criminal justice system that needs to be addressed. But I want to raise the vibration of the community, of the voices that we've heard today, and remind us and leave with that reflection and with those words. Baba Tony opened in our libation, which we found was important to ground ourselves in the vibration and the honoring of our ancestors. And he says, humanity originated in Africa, and that we need to refresh our freedom, refresh our dreams of freedom. Dr. Jamadar Kamara spoke about the study of the commission at the core of it. And this goes to what Councilor Bach was speaking about. At the core of it is repair, truth, and reconciliation. But let's not get truth and reconciliation as a way to avoid the deeper conversation, which is race and racism and oppression. So a process of healing and restoration has to come with accountability. And that accountability can only be dealt with if we have a true conversation about the ongoing racism and torture of people of African descent. So we also heard around the $8 from our families, from Reggie spoke, and still we're living in marginalized community. We heard from Councillor Campbell about adjusting our curriculum. We need to adjust our curriculum. So these are specific to Boston that we need to keep in mind as we move forward in thinking about the commission and forming the commission. Armani talked about the BPDA. That needs to be a real conversation. You know, we're going back and forth about what should be abolished and who should be abolished and who should stay. Boston right now is one of the third most expensive places to live. Our housing is a despair. What people are making and what they can to pay the rent does not connect. What is our AMI? What is the standard numbers that they're using that really allows the Black community to be seen in the economic breakup of Boston? Kevin spoke about the Faneuil Hall. You know, Aziza, one of our queens in this planning, has been really drilling us about preserving our history through arts. You know, as a poet and as a writer, it is a way to bring in our community in a different way. You know, what I saw will always stay with me was listening to testimonies as a commissioner in New Orleans and how the pain of our people, and then sort of using art and giving space for people to draw in between, and what came out of that. We need to find places to release this internal pain that may not, you know, as a trauma responder, when we go into trauma, we say the trauma is in your face. What our work is that we need to move the trauma out of our face so that we can see, but that it's still there because it will determine how we move forward. So let's keep that in mind. You know, Boston is in a place to ask the conversation, what is your relationship with the Black community? What is the legacy that we want to continue with? If we're not honest about our behaviors and our policies, as Michael said, Curry, and also Atia said, then we are not having a real conversation. You know, I could go on and on. Today was just the beginning. Tanisha, Tammy, Aziza, are you still here? I want to see you on camera. And Julia, you know, this was our initial conversation. This was not the beginning and ending. This was an opportunity to say to Boston, it is time to have a reparations conversation. It is time to address the inequality that still lives. It is time that when we're talking about reparation, mass and caste, methadone mile is a part of this conversation. This is Boston. I have traveled around the world and around the country to see that this is happening in Boston. It's such a conflict in the economic setup of Boston, what Boston is historically, and then what we're seeing on methadone mile. We need to come to terms with what our truth is, what we need to do to repair. Katie spoke about the pattern of racial violence that existed in Boston. So Boston, it is time. It is time. Reparations now, reparations now, reparations now.
Ashe to that all day, every day. Thank you. That was, I think that we have our marching orders. I think we have laid down a foundation for what this, the next set of action steps are here. But I wanted to also give Dr. Vandermeer a huge shout out, because his whole entire class have been Instagramming me, talking about that they're listening in, that they're paying attention. This is like his second class. And so just thank you, Dr. Vandermeer, for allowing your students to participate in this process and for bringing them into this conversation. It is so incredibly, this is what it looks like when we bring everybody in. And so your efforts in bringing your students into this conversation, 2 classes now, says a lot to your commitment and to your steadfast conviction to what it looks like to include all. So just thank you. One of your students asked me, I think his name is Isaiah, asked me to, Isaac, it was Isaac, he asked me to give you a public shout out and to acknowledge your hard work. So I'm doing that, Isaac. I got you, and thank you for advocating on behalf of your professor. But yes, you know, this particular hearing has been a little bit non-traditional, right? We have definitely gone way over the allotted time, but this is what it looks like when Yvette talks about it's time. It's time. Time takes a time. you know? And so I'm just so incredibly grateful for my colleagues and the leadership of the women who put this together, and all the panelists that spoke to really allow things to breathe. Because oftentimes we live in a culture that is just hurry up and let's just check off some boxes. But this particular hearing deserves so much more than that. And it's really allowing that space to have the conversation and to do so in ways that resonates with our soul. So thank you, Yvette, for grounding us in that truth, and everyone who participated in bringing us here. I'm so incredibly encouraged. And in the interest of time, I just wanted to ask my colleague, Councillor Bach, you have been listening in. I'd love to hear if you have any additional questions, final remarks, comments, your inspiration, how you feeling, where we're going with all of this. Councillor Bach, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Councillor Mejia, but I really don't want to be the one to close this out. I have been really grateful for the time. We don't always, as councillors, make time to be there for the whole hearing, but for me today, it's been really important listening to all of what everybody's been saying. And I think that there are so many threads here, and that's been really clear. And so to me, it has been an important thing today to put on the record, like someone was saying, sort of why it is that this is an important conversation. I think those of us who are steeped in history, a lot of the things that we've talked about today are familiar facts, but I think, as a number of people have raised, a lot of it is just still not acknowledged in our society, and it's not taught in our schools. And that history piece has been an important piece of what I've been trying to push for us to kind of look at with new eyes in Boston in general. But I think the point of not just, the idea that the history piece is step one, but then step two is what are we doing to actually repair that harm? What's the concrete policy move, and how do we bring more people into this conversation? It seems like you said, we have our marching orders. There's a lot of work to do ahead. And I'm just grateful for everyone on this call's leadership, and happy to be an ally and a partner in this. So thanks so much, Councillor Mejia.
Thank you. And I also want to, I'm going to thank Central staff for helping us with running this so smoothly. Thank you so very much. And I don't want to be the one to have the last word. So I'd like to give each of the women who worked on organizing this panel an opportunity to say their final remarks, and we will close out with your remarks. And again, thank you to everyone who tuned in, to the folks who did testimony, but you won't be hearing from me anymore. I'm going to step to the side and give the women who organized this an opportunity to close this out. I'm going to go first to Aziza.
Oh, this was wonderful. I just want to also thank the women and everybody, our history, our past, everyone, but definitely the women that I got to sit and hold hands and fight with. And it was that way, to be honest. But we got it done and we're here. And I want to thank community in moving forward as we really dig deep in thinking about how we touch, different people in different ways, in creative ways, and do some healing, because we need that too. But I just am happy, and this was wonderful. So next queen, you choose, Julia.
Okay, thank you, Aziza. I'm gonna go next to Tammy.
Yeah, how do you add anything? Just Ashe and Amen. And I'll just point out that what we witnessed here today, this is the repair work beginning, right? So on the road to getting reparations is our own repair, and doing this in community together. So just, Julia, just thank you for your continued leadership. Thank you for the partnership from everyone who's working on this together. And we've got more to go, but we've taken that first step. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna go next to Tanisha.
Thank you, Counselor. Thank you again to Yvette, Aziza, and Tammy. And thank you, Counselor Bach, for your participation in this hearing. What was not said, I don't think, Counselor Bach, is that, one of the things that was in the early days as we were talking about this, one of the things that was really important was for us to center this, as you heard from Dr. Kamara and Dr. Vandermeer, really center this and root this in the historical context to help move us forward, and certainly want to, acknowledge that as the professional historian on the council, it was important to have you as part of this conversation in recognizing the importance of bringing all of us into what hopefully will be an inflection point in our city's history of finally getting to a point where we are ready to understand our history, confront our truth, move toward justice, and achieve repair in the city so that all of us can move forward. And so again, want to just thank, I'm looking at 5 boxes here. Want to thank you all for your work today, but also your work going forward. And certainly to our panel of experts, you are but the tip of the iceberg of what exists in this community. And I look forward to more conversations within community about how we move this work forward. But I do want to caution us. I'm just going to say it. We need to move with a sense of urgency.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We need not spend another 12 months. We need not spend another 6 months trying to figure out how to get it done. We need to get this done. To formalize the structure through which we will do this work so that we can continue to get these things on these things on the record. And so I'm, for one, am going to be pushing us to take action, swiftly on this matter so that we can get to that on the continuum to that repair. So thank you.
Yes, y'all heard, we've all been put on notice, city councilors. We're gonna move this with urgency, so you all heard it here first. And so I would like to now, Yvette.
Yeah, and I sit here in deep appreciation, and I wanna, one of the things that has not been said is that we came together as a group, but we've all come in as leaders in different ways. Tammy with our, keeping us organized technology-wise, Aziza reminding us about community, but also Tanisha made the first move in going to Julia and say, let's get this ordinance filed. So let's get this hearing filed. So I want to folks to see how much of a collaborative effort this has been, and and that we are standing in the one thing that we have common in our movement is that we believe in the reparative justice of our community. So I want to close with the same way we started with Baba Tony giving libation. And I want to close by saying, may our ancestors continue to guide us on this journey. May we continue to uplift the vibration and the truth and the history and the pain and the joy of our ancestors, because even in the midst of the pain, we still found joy. And even in the midst of the pain, we still sit with joy. So as we move forward in urgency, as Tanisha says, because she is that charge for us, let's do no harm. Let us honor whose shoulders we stand on, and let us speak community's truth in the most righteous and honorable way, that reparative justice will vibrate through the streets of Boston. Ashe, amen.
And with that, I am asked to gavel us out. This hearing is officially to a close. Thank you so very much. Looking forward to the work that lies ahead and leaning in. Thank you all. Have a beautiful day.
Thanks, Julia. Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Okay, bye. That was great. Bella, bella, bella.
Gracias, querida.
Ciao.